There are places on this earth where the ground does not simply lie beneath your feet, but opens and swallows and remembers. Places where the sunlight surrenders at a threshold, and everything below belongs to a colder, older world. Imagine for a moment that you're standing on a wide and windswept plain in central Turkey, where the horizon runs flat and pale toward distant snow-capped volcanoes, and the wind carries the dry scent of dust and stone. Beneath your boots, the earth seems unremarkable. A field, a village, a basement perhaps, in a house not so different from the one you grew up in. And then you descend. One step, then another, into a narrow throat of rock, and the temperature drops, and the light thins, and the air changes its character entirely. It becomes the smell of stone and darkness, mineral, cool, faintly damp, the scent of a place the sun has never touched. You're entering Derinkuyu, and you're about to walk down into one of the most profound and unsettling human achievements ever carved from the living rock, 85 meters. That is how deep this city goes, 280 feet straight down through the pale volcanic stone, across 18 distinct levels stacked one beneath the other, like the chambers of some vast and patient heart. Room enough, when it was full, for 20,000 human beings. 20,000, with their livestock, with their grain, with their wine presses and their chapels and their stables and their wells. An entire civilization, folded into the darkness beneath a single field, breathing through shafts of stone that reach 55 meters toward the surface. Stand at the top of that descent and you're not looking at a ruin. You're looking down the gullet of something that was built to keep people alive when the world above had become a place of terror. And the first question, the question that will follow us down every tunnel and through every sealed door in the hours to come, is deceptively simple. Who dug this? And what, in the name of everything they held sacred, were they so desperate to hide from? Consider what it took. There were no machines here, no engines, no drills, no explosives, no electric light to push back the black. There were hands. There were bronze chisels and later iron picks, swung in the flickering, guttering glow of oil lamps and torches, in air that grew thicker and more precious with every meter they carved deeper. Someone thousands of years ago stood in the dark with a hand tool and began to cut a hole into the ground, and then kept cutting, downward and outward, level after level, room after room, tunnel after tunnel, until they had hollowed out a metropolis where before there had been only solid rock. And here is the detail that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. When the danger came, whatever it was, they climbed down into their carved city, and they rolled a great circular stone across the entrance, a wheel of rock weighing between 200 and 500 kilograms, a door that could only be moved from the inside, and they sealed themselves in. When those stones rolled shut, the people within did not simply hide, they disappeared. As one researcher put it, when those stones rolled shut, the entire civilization basically vanished from the face of the earth. That is the invitation of Derinkuyu. Not to study it, the way one studies a diagram or a dry account in a museum case, but to inhabit it. To imagine yourself among the 20,000, deep in the 8th or the 10th or the 18th level, with the weight of the whole world pressing down above your head, the lamplight throwing your shadow long against walls that hands like yours once shaped. To feel the fresh air moving, impossibly, against all logic, through tunnels 80 meters below the open sky, carried by ventilation shafts so cunningly placed that the deepest chambers never grow stale. This is not a place you observe from a safe distance. It reaches up and takes hold of you, because it was built for people, by people, in fear and in hope, and in the flickering half-light of the underworld. And it kept its silence for a very long time. For the strangest thing about Derinkuyu is not merely that it exists, but that for centuries the world above it had forgotten it entirely. The city slept beneath the village, its tunnels choked with rubble, its stone doors resting in their grooves, its chapels and stables silent, and no one knew. Life went on overhead, houses were built, fields were ploughed, and then, In 1963, a resident of the town of Longyou was renovating his home, breaking through a wall in his basement when the wall gave way onto darkness. Behind it lay a passage, and behind that passage lay another, and another, opening downward into a labyrinth that no living memory had recorded. A man swinging a hammer at his own cellar wall broke through into a city that had waited 85 meters beneath his feet, patient and complete for longer than anyone could say. The earth had kept its secret, and when it finally gave that secret up, it gave up more questions than answers. Who were they? The honest response is that the origins are debated, and that the debate is far from settled. The prevailing archaeological consensus does not credit a single people or a single moment. It sees Longyou as a work of many hands across many centuries, a palimpsest carved into stone. The initial excavation is most widely attributed to the Phrygians, that enigmatic Iron Age people of Anatolia, sometime in the 8th or 7th centuries before the Christian era. And then, later, much later, came the Great Expansion, when early Christians, during the long span of the Byzantine era, from roughly the 4th century to the 15th, drove the tunnels deeper and wider, transforming what may have begun as a refuge into a vast subterranean sanctuary, where they could escape persecution and the raids that swept across Anatolia like storms. Some fringe voices reach much further back, proposing origins 9,000 years old or more, a city older than almost any settlement on Earth. Mainstream archaeology sets those claims gently aside and dates the primary construction to the Phrygian period, with the Byzantine expansion layered over the top. Yet even the cautious, careful, consensus version of the story is staggering enough. A city carved by hand over 1,000 years and more, by peoples who did not fully understand what those before them had begun. Walk its chambers in your mind, and the sophistication reveals itself piece by piece. There are more than 50 ventilation shafts threading up through the rock, breathing life into the deepest levels, so cleverly designed that the air below remains fresh across 18 stories of stone. There are deep water wells, sunk so that the inhabitants could draw water without ever emerging into the daylight, without ever exposing themselves to whatever waited above, and sealed in places so that an enemy could not poison the supply from the surface. There are the great rolling stone doors, those 200 to 500 kilogram wheels of rock, set into carved grooves and pierced through the centre, that could be rolled shut and locked from within, and never from without. This was not a hole to hide in. This was a machine for survival, engineered with an understanding of air, of water, of defence, of human need that we are only beginning to appreciate. And it prompts a cluster of questions that will not quiet themselves. How did people without any of our instruments understand that air must be made to move through a space this deep? How did they navigate the darkness, level upon level, and never lose their way? And what does it mean that they built something so complete, so self-sufficient, so utterly sealed, that when they closed it they could vanish entirely from the world? To begin to answer even the smallest part of that, we must rise back to the surface and look at the land itself. For Longyou did not appear in defiance of its landscape, it appeared because of it. Cappadocia is a geological paradox, a place where the ground offered itself up to the chisel almost as an invitation, and to understand the city you must first understand the stone. Millions of years ago, long before any human hand was raised against this rock, the volcano spoke. Mount Erciyes, rising white and vast to the east, Mount Hassan to the southwest, Mount Guludar between them. They erupted again and again across the ages, and they blanketed the whole of central Anatolia in thick, smothering layers of ash and lava. The ash settled, it compacted, it solidified under its own weight, and the slow pressure of time into a rock called tough, soft, porous, pale, and above all carvable. And in many places this soft tuff was capped by a harder crust, a lid of basalt or andesite laid down by later, fiercer flows. This is the secret. This geological sandwich, soft flesh beneath a hard skin, is the reason a subterranean civilization could exist here and almost nowhere else. The tuff is soft enough that a person with an iron pick, or even a bronze chisel can cut into it steadily, hour after hour, carving out rooms and passages and stairways without needing to shatter or blast the stone. A determined family could enlarge their chamber in a season. A community given generations could hollow out a world. But softness alone would be a trap, for a soft ceiling collapses and a soft wall crumbles. Here is where the tough performs its quiet miracle. When it is cut and the fresh rock is exposed to the air, it hardens. The surface toughens, cures, sets, providing exactly the structural integrity needed to hold up a ceiling, to support a chamber, to bear the weight of 17 more levels stacked above. So the diggers cut what was soft, and the air made it strong, and the ceilings they carved 80 meters down have held their shape for millennia. The stone was easy to shape, and once shaped, refused to fall. It is almost as though the land had been waiting, prepared across geological time, for someone to come and read the instructions written into its layers. One observer, standing in the presence of that carved rock, remarked that the stone holds memory, that its texture and form embody both the violence of its volcanic birth and the tenderness of the hands that sculpted it. And there is something true in that, something that ordinary geology cannot quite capture. This is a stone made in fire and fury, in the catastrophic breath of mountains, and yet it yielded to fingers and tools with the softness of packed snow. Violence and tenderness held together in a single grey-gold rock. The landscape did not merely host these cities, it dictated them. It made them possible, and perhaps in some sense it made them inevitable. Where else on earth could 20,000 people vanish into the ground and take the whole apparatus of their lives with them? The earth here became a sanctuary, but only because ages before it had first been an inferno. And the tradition of cutting into this rock reaches back further than the Phrygians, further than the Christians who deepened Derinkuyu into a fortress. The deepest roots of the subterranean habit are often traced to the Hittites, that great Bronze Age power whose kings once ruled much of Anatolia. Some historians suggest that as early as around 1400 before the Christian era, the Hittites began carving shallow storage pits into this obliging tuff. Modest hollows at first, cool cellars for grain and provisions, refuges perhaps for a household or a herd when raiders passed through. Nothing on the scale of the later cities, but a beginning, a first understanding, passed hand to hand and generation to generation, that this stone would give shelter to those who asked it. From those humble pits, if the thread holds, everything else would eventually grow. The levels, the tunnels, the wells, the rolling doors, the whole immense architecture of hidden life. The Hittites, it seems, first whispered to the rock, and the rock, across 3,500 years, whispered back an entire underground world. But was it truly a single unbroken tradition, one long inheritance from shallow pit to 85-meter metropolis? Or did the knowledge come and go, forgotten and rediscovered, each people teaching itself anew what the stone would allow? The timeline resists us. It offers Hittites and Phrygians and Byzantines, layered like the tuff itself, and it refuses to say with certainty where one hand ended and the next began. Yet even as we stand at the mouth of Derinkuyu and try to grasp its scale, we have made a quiet error, for we have been speaking of it as though it were alone, a single marvel, an isolated wonder beneath a single village. It is nothing of the kind. Pull back from Derinkuyu, rise above the Cappadocian plain, and look across the whole region, and the true dimensions of the mystery begin to reveal themselves. Derinkuyu is not a city. It is the anchor of a system. It is the deepest node in a network so vast that we are still, even now, tracing its edges. Beneath this landscape lie other cities, Kaymakli, broad and sprawling, with its low ceilings and its tight defensible passages, Uzkonak, Tatlarin, And beyond these, at least 36 confirmed underground complexes have been documented across the region. 36 carved worlds, each with its own chambers and shafts and stone doors, each a refuge in its own right. And archaeologists suspect the true number climbs far higher still. Estimates suggest that the total count of such sites across Cappadocia may reach 200. 200 hidden cities folded into the earth of a single region. And they are not, it appears, separate. A tunnel roughly 9 kilometers long is believed to connect Longyou to Cappadocia, a subterranean road driven through solid rock, linking one buried city to another, so that people could pass from refuge to refuge without ever surfacing into the dangerous light of day. 9 kilometers underground, cut by hand. And when modern instruments were turned upon this landscape, when ground-penetrating radar surveys swept across the region in the 2010s, listening for the echoes of hollow spaces beneath the soil, the results suggested something almost beyond comprehension. The total subterranean network across Cappadocia, the linked and interwoven system of tunnels and chambers and connecting passages, may span over 200 kilometers. 200 kilometers of hollowed rock, threaded beneath the fields and villages and valleys, a shadow geography mirroring the world above. Somewhere down there, still uncharted, passages branch and turn and descend into darkness. No light has reached in centuries, and every meter of it was cut by human hands, in the smell of stone and darkness, one chisel stroke at a time. This is where the mystery ceases to be merely astonishing and becomes something more troubling. A single hidden city might be explained by a single frightened community, digging its own private refuge in a season of danger. But a network of this scale demands a different kind of explanation. Why does one valley in central Anatolia need this much underground space? Why did generation after generation return to the rock and carve deeper, wider, further, until the ground beneath an entire region was riddled with cities and joined by tunnels running for kilometers? What kind of sustained, coordinated, collective fear drives people to build not one hidden world but 200, and to link them together into a single vast apparatus of escape? Consider what 9 kilometers of connecting tunnel between two cities actually implies. It implies planning across communities. It implies that the people of Longyou and the people of Cappadocia were not strangers but partners, digging toward one another through the dark, coordinating an escape route that neither could complete alone. Who was directing that? Who held the map of it all in their mind across generations as the network grew? The scale of the engineering announces itself most eloquently in the defences. Those great circular stone doors, the wheels of rock weighing up to 500 kilograms, could be sealed from the inside, and only from the inside, so that once the community had descended and rolled the stone into place, no force from above could easily move it. But the doors were only the beginning of the design. The tunnels themselves were weapons. As one researcher observed, the passages were designed as a puzzle, a deliberate labyrinth that forced any invader who breached the entrance into narrow, low, single-file corridors, where a tall man had to stoop and a warrior could not raise his weapon, where the defenders knew every turn and the attacker knew none, and where an intruder could be neutralized one at a time in the choking dark. This is not the architecture of a storage cellar. This is the architecture of a people who expected to be hunted, and who built their homes to kill anyone who came for them. Every element, the depth, the shafts, the sealed wells, the rolling doors, the puzzle tunnels, speaks of a fear so deep and so enduring that it shaped the very stone across 1,000 years. For these cities were not carved once and abandoned. They were used and reused and expanded through wave after wave of terror across the centuries. The Great Byzantine expansion, from roughly the 7th century to the 11th, came as Christian communities sought refuge from Arab raids that swept up out of the south, and later still from Mongol incursions that came thundering across Anatolia. Each threat drove people back underground, and each generation deepened and strengthened the refuge it inherited. The cities remained in at least sporadic use for a very long time. Some accounts trace their inhabitation on and off, right up until the population exchange between Greece and Turkey in 1923, when the ancient rhythm of hiding and emerging was finally broken. For the better part of 3,000 years then, the people of this region knew that when the world above became too dangerous to bear, the earth below would take them in. They would gather their families and their animals and their stores of grain, and they would descend into the smell of stone and darkness, and they would roll the great stone shut behind them, and they would wait, in the lamplight, in the fresh, strange air of the ventilation shafts, in the deepest chambers 85 meters beneath the sky, for the danger to pass. And so the first great question of our journey hangs in the darkened air of Derinkuyu, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. It is not only who dug these cities, though that alone would occupy scholars for lifetimes. It is why the impulse ran so deep and lasted so long and spread so far. It is what manner of world drives human beings, across 100 generations, to hollow out 200 cities beneath their fields and link them with tunnels through the solid rock, and to build into every passage the machinery of concealment and defence. Standing there, at the threshold, with the cold breath of the underworld rising to meet you and the weight of the plain pressing down above, one cannot help but feel that these people were answering a fear we have not yet named. They carved a whole hidden civilization out of the memory of fire, and then they sealed it and vanished. And Cappadocia, extraordinary as it is only the first stop. For the same impulse, the same descent into the earth, the same sealing of the door behind, the same disappearance from the surface of the world, appears again and again across the whole face of the planet, in places that could not have known of one another, carved by peoples who never met. The ground remembers, and it is not finished telling us what it hid. Return for a moment to the doors, for of all the elements the ancient carvers left behind in the deep chambers of Cappadocia, it is the rolling stones that hold the clearest confession, the plainest evidence of intent. Consider what they are, and how they work, and what their very existence tells us about the minds that made them. They are circular slabs of basalt, dense, dark volcanic stone, quarried and shaped with immense labour, some of them reaching well over a metre across and weighing as much as 500 kilograms, half a ton of rock ground into a great wheel. They are not hung on hinges, they are not set into frames like the doors we know. Instead, each one was mounted in an angled niche carved into the wall beside the tunnel it guarded, a shallow channel cut so that the disc could be rolled out across the throat of the passage and dropped into place, sealing the corridor from floor to ceiling. And here is the detail that changes everything, the small mechanical fact that carries a whole world of meaning within it. The doors could be closed only from the inside. The niche, the angle, the slope of the channel, all of it was engineered so that a person standing within the sealed chamber could push the great wheel out and let it settle into position, blocking the way, while anyone on the outside in the tunnel beyond could find no purchase, no grip, no leverage to move it back. Once rolled shut, a level of Derinkuyu became, in the plainest possible terms, impregnable. Think carefully about what that means. A door that locks from both sides is a door meant to control passage, to keep some in and some out, to manage a threshold in ordinary times. But a door that can be sealed only from within is something else entirely. It is not a door for daily life. It is a door for the last extremity, for the moment when the people are already inside and the enemy is already at the gate, when the only question remaining is whether the wall will hold. It presumes a scenario in which those below have retreated as far as they can go, have gathered their families and their food and their animals into the deepest refuge, and now need only to close the world off behind them and wait. This is the architecture of the bolt hole, and it obeys a logic all its own. A bolt hole is not a home, though people lived in it. It is not a fortress, though it could not be taken. It is a place of last resort, built on the assumption that the surface will one day become uninhabitable, and that when that day comes, survival will mean disappearance. The rolling stone is the physical expression of that assumption, ground patiently into half a ton of basalt by hands that knew, with grim certainty, that the day would come. And the mainstream reading of these doors is entirely consistent with that logic. Archaeologists interpret them exactly as they appear, as defensive seals, part of a comprehensive system of concealment and protection that included the puzzle tunnels, the hidden wells, the ventilation shafts disguised at the surface. There is no great mystery in their purpose. There is, if anything, a chilling clarity. Yet the clarity itself raises a question that the stones cannot answer, and it is the question at the very heart of this journey. For a people do not go to the extraordinary trouble of quarrying, shaping and installing hundreds of these massive discs, each one representing days or weeks of skilled labour in the dim underground, each one a monument to defensive obsession, unless they are answering a threat of the most serious and sustained kind. You do not build a door that kills to keep out a nuisance. What then was coming for them? What manner of danger was so total, so recurring, so inescapable, that the only rational response was to carve a city 85 metres into the earth and fit it with wheels of stone that could be rolled shut against the light? There is a small, terrible detail preserved in the scholarly record that brings this into sharp and human focus. In the very centre of many of these rolling doors, a hole was cut, a small aperture, a few centimetres across, bored clean through the basalt at the middle of the disc. To the casual eye it might seem a curiosity, a handhold perhaps, or a fitting for some lost mechanism. But the anthropologist R. M. Dawkins, writing of these underground refuges as early as 1916, understood its darker purpose. Through that small central hole, the defenders within could see and strike at whatever pressed against the door from the far side. An arrow loosed through the aperture, or a spear thrust into the crowded dark of the tunnel beyond, could find an enemy who had breached the outer defences and now stood, pinned by the very narrowness of the passage, before the sealed stone. The invaders, Dawkins recorded, were sometimes thwarted by exactly such means, killed one by one through a hole in a door they could neither move nor pass. Consider the mind that engineered that hole. It is not enough to such a mind that the door be impassable. The door must also be lethal. The refuge must not merely conceal its people. It must be capable of destroying anyone who comes close enough to threaten them. This is not paranoia in the ordinary sense. This is the memory of catastrophe, cut into stone and passed down through generations who kept the doors in working order, because they knew, from bitter experience, that they would be needed again. So the doors give us our first hard clue, and it is this. These cities were not built to hide things. They were built to hide people. The distinction is everything. A hoard of treasure, a sacred relic, a cache of grain. These can be concealed in a simple cellar, a walled chamber, a buried jar. They do not require ventilation shafts reaching 55 metres to the surface. They do not require wells sunk to underground water so that a besieged population might drink without ever emerging. They do not require stables for livestock and presses for wine, and chambers enough to hold 20,000 souls, and half-ton doors that seal from within and kill through a hole in the middle. All of that immense, patient, generational labour serves one purpose and one purpose only: to keep human beings alive, in darkness, for as long as the terror above endured. The question that hangs over Derinkuyu is not, at bottom, an engineering question. It is a question about fear. What threat was large enough and constant enough to drive tens of thousands of people underground at once, and to keep the memory of that descent alive across 100 generations? For at least one long chapter of the city's history, we can name the threat with some confidence, and it is worth dwelling on that chapter, because it shows us not a single act of construction, but a process, an inheritance deepened and repurposed across the centuries. The most thoroughly documented use of the Cappadocian underground belongs to the Byzantine Christians of roughly the 6th to the 11th centuries, and to understand why they descended, one must understand the world that pressed upon them from above. In the 7th century, the armies of the early Islamic caliphates burst northward out of Arabia and Syria, and the frontier between the Christian Byzantine Empire and the new Muslim powers came to rest, for generation after generation, across the highlands of Anatolia. For centuries the Umayyad and later the Abbasid forces sent raiding columns, swift, mounted, seasonal, deep into Byzantine territory, striking at farms and villages and towns, carrying off captives and plunder, and withdrawing before any imperial army could gather to face them. This was not a single war with a beginning and an end. It was a rhythm, a recurring season of terror that returned like the weather, year upon year, across the whole of the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. And the people of Cappadocia, exposed on that contested plateau with no wall high enough and no army near enough to protect them, answered the rhythm of the raids with a rhythm of their own. When the raiders came, they went down. They did not, however, arrive at empty stone. The genius of the Byzantine period lies not in beginning, but in inheriting. The tuff of Cappadocia had been carved long before, the earliest chambers traced to the deep antiquity of the region, storage rooms and simple shelters hollowed from the soft volcanic rock by peoples whose names are half lost to us. What the Byzantine communities did was to take that inheritance and drive it deeper, wider, more complex than any earlier age had dreamed. They repurposed old storage chambers into living quarters and stables. They extended tunnels and sank new levels. They connected refugees to one another and to the surface with an ever more intricate system of shafts and passages, until the earlier, simpler shelters had become an 18-level subterranean metropolis capable of holding a small city's worth of people through an extended siege. The result is not the work of a single campaign or a single visionary. It is the accumulated labour of successive generations, each adding to what the last had left, each deepening the refuge in answer to a threat that would not go away. Derinkuyu as we find it today is a palimpsest in stone, layer upon layer of human fear and human ingenuity, written and rewritten across 1,000 years. And within that deep carved city, the Byzantines left behind the clearest possible proof of who they were and how they lived below. For among the stables and the wine presses and the grain stores, tucked into the lower levels where the great doors could seal them away from any intrusion, there are churches. Not chapels improvised in a corner, but rooms built to the classic proportions of Byzantine ecclesiastical architecture. Spaces with apses curving at their eastern ends, with the long central nave that the liturgy required, with barrel vaults arching overhead, cut entire from the living rock so far beneath the fields that no daylight could ever reach them. Here, in the deepest dark, the refugees carved out the shape of their faith and enacted it. They gathered before rock-cut altars. They sang the offices in the lamplight. They marked the feasts and the fasts of the church calendar in chambers that no invader could find and no army could breach. The presence of these churches is the final confirmation of the underground city's purpose, that it was not merely a place to hide the body, but a place to sustain the whole life of a community, its worship and its ritual and its continuity through the long night of a siege. To descend into a Byzantine church at Derinkuyu is to stand inside the answer to the question the doors first posed. The people came here to survive, yes, but they came also to remain themselves, to keep their faith and their identity intact while the world above burned. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that image. Imagine the scene when the alarm was raised. A rider on the horizon, a smudge of smoke from a neighbouring village, the drumming of hooves carried on the wind. Imagine the villages emptying downward, the animals driven into the tunnel mouths, the grain hauled below, the families descending level by level into the smell of stone and oil smoke, the great doors rolled shut behind them one after another until the whole community was sealed inside the earth. And then imagine the days that followed, the waiting in the lamplit chambers, the fresh, strange air drawn down through the shafts, the children kept quiet in the dark, the water drawn from wells that the enemy above could never reach, and, deep in the lowest levels, the sound of the liturgy rising in a rock-cut church that the world would not discover for 1,000 years. This was survival raised to the level of an art, and it worked. The raids came, and the raids passed, and the people emerged into the light and returned to their fields, and they kept the doors in working order against the certainty that they would be needed again. For century upon century, this was the shape of life in Cappadocia, a life lived in the shadow of descent, always one alarm away from the underworld. And here we arrive at the pattern that will haunt the whole of this journey, for the impulse that drove the people of Cappadocia into the earth was not theirs alone. It repeats across continents and across centuries, among peoples who had never heard of one another, who spoke unrelated tongues and worshipped different gods, and lived in landscapes that could not have been more unlike the volcanic plateau of Anatolia. And so we leave the tough of Cappadocia behind, and we travel far to the west and north, across the whole breadth of Europe, to a quiet stretch of farmland in the Picardy region of northern France, to the chalk uplands above a village called Naos. At first glance, there is nothing here to suggest what lies beneath. Picardy is a gentle country of low green hills and open fields, of church spires and slow rivers, a landscape that seems to hold no secrets deeper than the roots of its beech woods. The village of Naos sits quietly among these fields, unremarkable, ordinary, the kind of place a traveller might pass through without a second glance. Yet beneath its calm surface, hollowed out of the soft chalk of the plateau, lies a hidden world, a vast subterranean network of some 300 chambers linked by around 28 galleries, carved 30 meters or so into the earth. The people of this region called them the mouches, a word from the old Picard tongue that means simply hiding places. And a hiding place is exactly what they were. For here, on the far side of Europe, in a landscape utterly unlike Cappadocia, and among a people who had never dreamed of Longyou, human beings had reached entirely independently for precisely the same solution. When the world above became too dangerous to endure, they went down. The mouches of Naos could shelter as many as 3,000 villagers, together with their livestock, through the recurring terrors of the 17th and 18th centuries, through the long agony of the 30 Years' War that tore across this part of Europe between 1618 and 1648, and through the waves of conflict and marauding soldiery that swept these fields again and again in the decades that followed. And here too we find the same obsessive attention to concealment that marks the Cappadocian cities, the same understanding that a refuge is only as good as its ability to remain unseen. The people of Naos faced a problem the underground dwellers of the world all share. A hidden population must still breathe and must still cook, and cooking makes smoke. And smoke, rising from an empty field, betrays the presence of those below as surely as any footprint. Their solution was ingenious. The chimneys that vented the smoke from the galleries were routed upward through the hearths of the cottages on the surface, so that when the villagers were hidden below, the smoke of their fires appeared to rise quite naturally from the chimneys of the houses above, as though ordinary life continued in the village while, 30 meters beneath, 3,000 people crouched in the chalk-cut dark, listening. To an enemy passing through, the village would seem merely quiet. Nothing would suggest that its entire population had vanished into the earth beneath his feet. Consider the distance, the sheer, staggering distance between these two places. Cappadocia and Picardy are separated by thousands of miles, by mountains and seas and the whole width of a continent. They are separated too by centuries. The Byzantine peak of Longyou had passed into memory long before the villagers of Naos first fled into their chalk galleries. The peoples who made them were unrelated in blood and language and belief. There is no line of transmission between them, no lost teacher who carried the technique from Anatolia to France, no secret guild passing the knowledge hand to hand across the medieval world. And yet they arrived at the same answer, down to the smallest details of its logic: the descent into the earth, the concealment of the entrances, the disguising of the smoke, the sheltering of livestock alongside the people, the transformation of an ordinary landscape into a false and empty surface above a hidden multitude. This is the recurring truth that our journey will uncover again and again, that when human beings are frightened enough for long enough, they reach, independently and across all the barriers of distance and time, for the same solution. They go down. The earth becomes the refuge of last resort, the mother that takes the terrified in and hides them from whatever hunts them across the surface of the world. The Mushas of Naur, like so many of these refugees, eventually slipped from memory. As the wars receded and the long peace of later centuries settled over Picardy, the galleries were forgotten, sealed off by time and disuse, until in 1887 a local priest, the Abbot Ernest Danicourt, rediscovered the vast network beneath his parish and began the slow work of exploring what his ancestors had hidden. But the Mushas were not finished with terror. Their strangest and most moving chapter still lay ahead, and it would come not from the wars of kings, but from the greatest catastrophe the modern world had yet devised. For scarcely a generation after their rediscovery, the fields of Picardy would become the killing ground of the First World War, and the old hiding places of Naur, 30 metres beneath the chalk, would fill once more with frightened men. Not villagers this time, but soldiers, drawn from the far side of the earth, come to leave their marks upon the ancient walls in the brief and desperate respites between the horrors of the Somme. They came in their tens of thousands, and they came from everywhere. In the summer of 1916, and through the long months that followed, the flat farmland of Picardy became the anteroom of the greatest slaughter the world had yet known. The Somme offensive, launched on the 1st of July that year, would grind on into the autumn, consuming lives at a rate that beggars comprehension, and the villages behind the lines swelled with soldiers waiting their turn to be fed into it. They came from Britain and from Canada, from France's own colonies and from the United States, and above all, in numbers that would leave their signature indelibly upon the chalk. They came from Australia. Young men who had crossed the entire span of the planet sailed from Sydney and Melbourne and the small towns of the outback, to fight, and so many of them, to die in a country whose name they could barely pronounce. And in the days before they went forward, in the strange suspended time between arrival and the front, they went sightseeing. This is one of the small, aching truths of the Great War, so at odds with our images of mud and wire and mechanized death, that the men behind the lines were still tourists, still curious, still human. Word spread among the billets and the marching columns that near the village of Naur there lay a marvel, an underground city, vast and ancient, where people had once hidden from the wars of long-dead kings. It was a curiosity, an outing, a way to spend a few precious hours of leave before returning to the guns. And so they came, in twos and threes and small companies, down into the chalk-cut dark that their forebears in fear had never dreamed would shelter warriors from the other side of the world. We know they came, and we know precisely how they felt because they told us. On the smoothed white walls of the Muches, in pencil and in blue ink, they left behind an archive of themselves, an archive that lay in the darkness for nearly a century before anyone thought to read it. When the archaeologist Gilles Prilot of France's National Institute for Preventive Archaeological Research began his study of the site in 2014, his interest was medieval. He had come for the quarries and the wars of religion, for the older strata of the site's long history. What he found instead was a concentration of First World War graffiti so dense, so extensive, so overwhelming that it transformed the entire meaning of the place. Across the galleries, his team began to catalogue the inscriptions. Hundreds, then 1,000, then 2,000, and still they were not finished. The final tally is estimated to lie somewhere between 2,000 and 3,200, and even that is likely too low, for some of the marks are set in passages now too fragile or too inaccessible to survey. The overwhelming majority were left by Australians, over 2,200 recorded, alongside British, Canadian, American, and French hands. Look closely at how they were made, and the century that separates us from these men seems to collapse in an instant. Before writing, the soldiers took the blades of their pocket knives and smoothed the rough chalk of the wall until it offered a clean surface. Then, in pencil, ordinary wooden pencils the same as a schoolboy might carry, or in careful blue ink they wrote their names. They wrote their regimental numbers, those cold administrative digits that the army had assigned to each of them, and which each of them, evidently, wished to see set down somewhere that was not a ledger of the dead. They wrote the names of their hometowns, the distant places to which they longed to return, the streets and suburbs and country districts on the far side of the earth. Some drew small pictures, emblems of home and of self, and Prillo, standing before these marks, gave voice to the eeriest quality of the whole assemblage. Most of the soldiers, he observed, left their marks using wooden pencils, so that it feels as though the inscriptions were made just 5 minutes ago. There is no patina of age upon them, no fading into anonymity. The graphite still sits crisp upon the chalk. The hand that wrote might have withdrawn only a moment before you arrived. Consider what such an act meant, and when it was performed. These were men who knew, with a clarity that few human beings are ever forced to face, that they might have only days to live. They were being marched toward a battlefield where the casualty lists ran to the tens of thousands in a single morning, where a man's chances of surviving unwounded were slim, and his chances of surviving whole were slimmer still. And in that knowledge, in the shadow of that near certainty, what did they do? They descended into the earth, smoothed a patch of ancient wall, and wrote down who they were. Not a message to a loved one. The walls were not letters, not a prayer, though surely they prayed. Simply the assertion, carved into the oldest and most patient of surfaces, I was here. This is my name. This is the place I came from. Remember that I existed. It is impossible to stand in those galleries, before those thousands of penciled names, and not feel the full weight of what they represent. Each inscription is a small defiance of oblivion, a hand reaching out of the dark toward a future the writer would very likely never see, and the record holds particulars that pierce even more deeply. Among the names is that of Gunner Lieutenant Leslie Russell Blake, a man whose life reads like an adventure novel cut brutally short, an Antarctic explorer, one of that heroic breed who had mapped the frozen ends of the earth and who then turned his cartographer's skill to the mapping of front lines in France before he was killed in 1918, so near to the war's end. And there is Private Wilfred Alsop, who did something that the vast majority of these men did not. He dated his visit. On the 2nd of January 1917, he wrote upon the chalk that at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 10 of them had gone to the famous caves near Naos, where refugees used to hide in times of invasion. A single, factual sentence, the record of an afternoon's excursion, written in the flat, plain diction of a young man on leave, and behind it, the whole shadow of the war that waited for him above. Here, then, we arrive at a truth that will follow us into every dark place our journey enters. These caverns are not merely feats of engineering, not merely puzzles of tools and labour and vanished technique. They are vessels of human fear, and fear, it seems, accumulates in them across the centuries like sediment settling on the floor of a still lake. Consider the strata of the Muches of Naur. First, in the 3rd century came the quarrymen, cutting limestone from the plateau for reasons purely practical. Then came the villagers of the medieval and early modern wars, fleeing the mercenaries and marauders of the 30 Years' War, disguising their smoke, sheltering their livestock, crouching in the dark while armies passed overhead. And then, 3 centuries later still, came the soldiers of the Somme, drawn by the very legend of that earlier hiding, leaving their names upon walls that had already absorbed one epoch of terror before their own. Every crisis, it seems, leaves its layer. The underground remembers what the surface forgets. Above ground, the war's end, the dead are buried, the fields are ploughed again, the villages rebuilt, the terror of one generation fading into the schoolbook abstraction of the next. But below, in the sealed and unchanging dark, the marks of dread endure. The smoothed wall, the penciled name, the sooted chimney, the rolling stone that could only be closed from within. The earth is patient. It keeps what is given to it. And when the archaeologist descends with his lamp, he reads not one moment of fear but a whole geology of it, layer upon layer, each crisis pressing its record into the stone above the last. What other refuges, one cannot help but wonder, hold such buried archives of dread, waiting in the dark for someone patient enough to read them? And how many of the frightened, across how many centuries, have left their names in places we have not yet thought to look? From this plateau of chalk and memory, our journey now turns eastward, far eastward, across the entire breadth of Asia, to a green and humid corner of southeastern China, where the earth guards a secret so complete that it makes even the mysteries of Naur and Cappadocia seem, by comparison, well lit. For in the Muches at least, we know who came and why. We have their names in their own hands, we have the legends that drew them, we have the wars that drove their ancestors below. But there are places where the record is silent, utterly, absolutely silent, and it is toward the deepest of these silences that we now descend. In June of 1992, in the village of Xianbekun, in Zhejiang province, a group of villagers set out to solve a small local mystery of their own. There were ponds in the village, still and dark, that the local people had always called bottomless. No one knew how deep they truly went. They were part of the landscape, features as familiar and unremarkable as any hill or field, and the villagers had lived alongside them for as long as anyone could remember, never suspecting what lay beneath the black water. And then, that summer, they decided to drain one, to pump it dry, perhaps to see what was down there, perhaps merely to be rid of the standing water. So they set their pumps to work and the water level fell and fell and fell. What emerged as the water drained was not the muddy bottom of a pond. It was a ceiling, a vast carved man-made ceiling, sloping away into darkness, and beneath it a chamber of such scale that the mind refused at first to accept it. Where the villagers had expected mud and rock, they found instead an enormous artificial cavern, its walls and pillars and vaulted roof shaped by human hands. And when they explored further, when they drained the neighbouring ponds, they discovered that the first cavern was not alone. There was another beside it, and another beyond that, and another, until the full count reached 24 grottos, some sources say as many as 36, hollowed out of the sandstone hill they call Fenghuang, or Phoenix Hill. Together they cover more than 30,000 square metres. This is no cellar, no hiding hole, no modest quarry. This is an underground world, a subterranean architecture on a scale that ranks among the great excavations of antiquity, and it had lain hidden beneath the placid ponds of an ordinary village, unremarked and unrecorded for more than 2,000 years. The scale of the thing is difficult to hold in the mind. The builders removed an estimated 1 million cubic metres of rock, 1 million cubic metres, cut and hauled and disposed of grotto by human labour alone. When the archaeologist Liu Weijin surveyed the site and reckoned the effort involved, he reached for the only comparison vast enough to convey it. The labour, he judged, was comparable to that required to raise the Great Pyramid of Giza. Some estimates suggest that 1,000 people, working continuously, would have needed 6 years to complete the task. And these were not rough diggings, not the crude hollowings out of desperate refugees scraping shelter from the softest available stone. They are shaped. They are finished. They have pillars, deliberately left standing to bear the weight of the roofs above. They have walls that rise sheer and true. They have chambers of ordered, intentional geometry. Someone planned this. Someone directed it. Someone commanded the labour of a small army to carve a hidden city out of the living rock, and then, it seems, made certain that no one would ever know. For here is the mystery that sets Longyou apart from every other site our journey has entered, and that crystallises the deepest enigma of all these subterranean places. China is a civilization obsessed with the written record. For more than 2,000 years, its bureaucracy has been among the most meticulous the world has ever produced. A state that counted its granaries, catalogued its taxes, recorded its officials, and set down its histories in dynasty after dynasty of scrupulous chronicle. If any civilization on Earth would be expected to have documented a public work on the scale of Longyou, it is this one. And yet not a single document, not one line in all the vast archive of Chinese history explains who built the Longyou caves, or why, or how. The pottery fragments found in the silt suggest a date of around 200 years before the Common Era, in the era of the Western Han. And around that date, nothing. Silence. 1,000,000 cubic meters of rock removed by 1,000 hands over 6 years, and the most literate bureaucracy in the ancient world has left us not one word about it. How does that happen? How does a project of pyramid-scale labour, undertaken by a state organised enough to command it, simply vanish from the memory of a people who wrote down almost everything? Where are the accounts, the requisitions, the names of the overseers? Where is the boast of the king who ordered it, or the complaint of the peasants who dug it? What could be so secret or so shameful, or so utterly forgotten, that a work of this magnitude leaves no trace in the record save the caverns themselves? The mystery deepens the moment one turns from the question of history to the evidence of the walls, for the walls are covered in a signature that has baffled every discipline that has examined it. Across every surface of the Longyou grottos, without exception, runs a single, uniform pattern of chisel marks. Parallel bands, each roughly 60 centimeters wide, filled with fine diagonal striations, and every one of those striations cut at an angle of precisely 60 degrees. Floor, wall, pillar, ceiling, it makes no difference. Wherever the human hand touched the stone, it left the same mark, the same angle, the same disciplined rhythm, repeated across 30,000 square meters of carved rock. And the consistency is not approximate. The error margin of the parallel textures, those who have measured them report, is no more than half a centimetre. Half a centimetre across surfaces the size of cathedrals cut by hand in the dark 2,000 years ago. Stand in one of those grottos with a lamp raised to the wall and run your eyes along the striations, and the effect is uncanny in the extreme. There is nothing rough about it, nothing improvised. It has the regularity of something machined, the disciplined uniformity of a pattern laid down not by the varying hands of many labourers, but by a single, codified method, applied with unwavering precision across an entire underground realm. And yet, and this is what turns the uncanny into the truly inexplicable, not a single tool has ever been found. No chisels, no picks, no hammers, no discarded implements of any kind. No blueprint, no plan, no inscribed instruction. The builders removed 1,000,000 cubic meters of stone, finished every surface to a tolerance of half a centimetre, and then departed, taking with them every trace of how it was done, leaving only the marks themselves and the vast and silent question of what they mean. Conventional archaeology, faced with this silence, does what it must. It reasons from the evidence at hand and constructs the likeliest account. And the likeliest account is that the striations are the ordinary consequence of a systematic quarrying technique, that a large disciplined workforce trained in a single method worked across the site in an organised progression, each labourer swinging his tool in the same practised motion, producing the same angled cut, until the whole was covered in the uniform pattern we now see. The precision on this reading is not mysterious at all. It is simply the fingerprint of organisation, the mark of a workforce so thoroughly drilled and directed that its output achieved the consistency of a machine. Yet reproducing that consistency proves harder than the explanation suggests. For how does one drill 1,000 human beings, working across 6 years and 30,000 square meters in the deep and total dark, to a uniformity of half a centimetre? The human hand is variable by nature. Fatigue changes it, skill changes it, the mood and strength of the individual labourer changes it. To achieve, across so vast a canvas, a pattern so free of variation, one must imagine either a single master hand directing every stroke, an impossibility at that scale, or a technique so rigorously codified, so precisely taught and enforced, that it survived undiminished through the whole immense labour. Either way, we are driven back to the same conclusion, that behind the Longyou caves stood an organisation of formidable discipline and sophistication, a body capable of imposing exact standards upon a mass of workers deep beneath the earth. And of that organisation, the meticulous historians of China tell us nothing at all. Into this silence the theories have poured, and one in particular gives the mystery its political edge. The Longyou region lies within the ancient heartland of the state of Wu, one of the warring powers whose rivalries convulsed China in the centuries before its unification. One prominent researcher, Yang Hongxun, has proposed that the caverns were commissioned around the 5th century before the Common Era by a king of that world, that they were dug to conceal troops, a hidden army secreted beneath the earth in the aftermath of a military defeat, held in reserve where no enemy could see them. It is a compelling idea, resonant with everything our journey has already learned about the underground as a place of concealment and last resort. But it remains a theory among theories, for others hold to the later hand dating, and still others reach for quite different purposes. Imperial granaries, cut cool and dry into the stone to store the grain of an empire, mausoleums for the honoured dead, ritual spaces devoted to rites we can no longer name. And it is here that a darker possibility rises to meet the silence in the record, a possibility that will become a thread running through the whole of our journey. What if the absence of documentation is not an accident of preservation, not the ordinary loss of records to fire and flood and the passage of centuries, but something deliberate? For the century in which the Longyou caverns may have been sealed and forgotten was one of the most violent acts of erasure in all of human history. When Qin Shi Huang unified the warring states into the First Chinese Empire, he set out to remake the world's memory to suit his new order. His was the reign of the burning of the books, the great consolidation and destruction of the records of the states he had conquered, a systematic effort to sweep away the histories, the philosophies, the local chronicles of the vanquished, so that the past itself might be rewritten in the image of the victor. Could it be, then, that the Longyou caverns fell into that silence not by chance but by design? That a work commissioned by one of the doomed states of the old order, perhaps that hidden army of the King of Wu, perhaps some project we cannot even guess at, was among the things that the new empire chose to unremember? That the grottos were sealed, the ponds allowed to fill above them, and the records of their making consigned to the flames, until the whole underground world simply ceased to exist in the memory of the people who lived above it? We cannot know. The theory, like all the others, rests on inference and silence, but it opens a possibility that reframes everything, and that we'll meet again in other places and other centuries, that the underground is not only an archive of fear, but a site of erasure. A place where the powerful hide not merely their people, but their secrets, and where the very silence of the historical record may itself be a kind of monument, the deliberate unwriting of what someone long ago did not wish to be remembered. For now the 24 grottos of Fenghuang Hill keep their counsel, as they have kept it for more than 2,000 years. The pillars stand in the dark exactly as their makers left them. The striations run across every surface at their unwavering 60 degrees. The tools are gone, the plans are gone, the names of the diggers and their master are gone, and the black water that hid them for so long lapped patiently at the ceilings of a lost world, while dynasty after dynasty rose and fell overhead. 1,000,000 cubic meters of stone, removed by hands we cannot name, for reasons we cannot fathom, recorded nowhere in all the archives of the most careful bureaucracy the world has known. It is, as one who studied it observed, an enduring mystery that has perplexed the experts of every discipline that has examined it, and it stands, silent and complete, as the deepest riddle our journey has yet uncovered. From the drowned grottos of Zhejiang, our journey turns westward once more, across the whole breadth of the Asian landmass, over the high passes of the Pamir and the salt deserts of Persia, to a small town on the rim of the Iranian plateau, where the earth keeps a secret in the floor of every kitchen. The town is called Nushabad, and it lies near the ancient oasis city of Kashan, in what is today Isfahan province, in a landscape that seems to offer nothing to the eye but sun-baked mud brick and the flat, shimmering distance. Here the surface world is a study in patience and heat, narrow lanes shaded against the merciless light, courtyards where the air itself seems to thicken at noon, wells sunk deep into the parched ground in search of the cool water that gives the place its name. For Nushabad means, in the old telling, the city of cold, sweet water, and it is a name that carries within it both a blessing and a warning. That in this country, water and safety are the same thing, and both must be sought below. At first glance, Nushabad appears an unremarkable Iranian town, one among 1,000 such settlements strung along the desert margins, where human beings have clung to life for millennia. Yet beneath its streets and its houses, hidden from the sunlight for perhaps 1,500 years, runs a second city, a labyrinth carved into the earth on 3 descending levels, reaching to a depth that accounts variously give as 16 meters, 18, even 22, a whole subterranean world of corridors and chambers and shafts that the people above walked over without knowing, generation upon generation, until the day the earth gave way beneath one man's feet. The story of its rediscovery has the same accidental, almost comic quality that we have met before in Cappadocia, where a resident broke through his basement wall in 1963 and found a whole civilization waiting in the dark. Here the accounts differ. Some place the moment in 2006 during the renovation of a private home. Others reach back to 2002, and still others to a date as early as 1983. But the essence of the tale is constant across every version. A man of Nushabad, working at the floor of his own house, breaks through the stone or the packed earth beneath his feet and falls into a corridor that no living person had walked in centuries, into a passageway carved by hands that had turned to dust before the town above him had taken its present shape. He picks himself up in the darkness, and he finds that the ground he has lived upon his whole life is not solid at all, but honeycombed, hollowed, threaded through with the memory of a people who once vanished into the earth and never wrote down where they had gone. The underground city that was revealed is called Longyou, though the town above has lent it its own name, and archaeologists who have surveyed it, among them the Iranian scholar who dated its core, place its origins in the Sassanid period, that last great flowering of pre-Islamic Persia, which held the plateau from the 3rd century of our era to the 7th, and which stood for 4 centuries as the eastern rival of Rome. It was a hard age to live through. The Sassanid world was the hinge upon which 2 empires ground against each other, and beyond the reach of the emperors lay the raiders of the steppe and the desert, for whom a prosperous oasis town was not a home but a harvest. Nor did the danger end with the fall of the Sassanids. Longyou saw continued use across the long centuries that followed, through invasion and dynasty, and the coming of new faiths and new conquerors, and its refuge was needed again by tradition when the Mongols swept across Persia in the 13th century, leaving cities of the dead where cities of the living had stood. The underground remembered its purpose. It was built once, and it served many times, and each generation that fled into it added, perhaps, its own small labour to the whole. What makes Longyou extraordinary, even among the underground cities we have already walked, is not its depth, which is modest beside Derinkuyi's 85 metres, nor its scale, but the principle of its concealment. For the entrances to this hidden city were not gathered at some central guarded gate. They were dispersed, scattered, woven into the fabric of ordinary domestic life. A hidden door behind the oven of a private kitchen, a trapdoor beneath the floor of a family's home, a concealed shaft descending from the bottom of a public water cistern, so that a person drawing water in the open square might, at a word, slip down into the earth and disappear. Each household held a fragment of the whole. Each family knew its own way down, its own corridor, its own small piece of the labyrinth, and crucially, no more than that. Consider what this means, and what a cold and brilliant intelligence it reveals. In Cappadocia we saw the logic of the rolling stone, the door sealable only from within, the puzzle tunnel that forced an invader into single file. Those were defences of the body, walls and traps to keep an enemy out. But the design of Longyou is a defence of knowledge itself. By ensuring that no single resident possessed a complete map of the network, the builders had solved a problem that walls alone can never solve, the problem of the captured tongue. For an enemy who breaches the surface can take prisoners. He can threaten, he can torture, he can offer bribes, and a frightened human being faced with such things may tell everything he knows. But what if no one knows everything? What if the whole is divided among 100 households, so that the most a captive can betray is his own family's stare, and the city beyond it remains a rumour even to those who dwell within it? Could it be that the builders of Uyi understood 15 centuries ago a principle that our own age has rediscovered and named? That the surest way to keep a secret is to ensure that no one person holds all of it. That knowledge, deliberately fragmented, becomes a fortress no torturer can storm. The corridors of Uyi are narrow enough that a person must move through them carefully, sometimes stooping, and they open into chambers set at different depths, connected by shafts that carried air down into the deep, and channels that carried water through it. The engineering is spare and purposeful, without ornament, without the churches we found carved into the Cappadocian tuff, or the great pillared halls of Longyou. This is not a monument, it is a machine for disappearing, and the accounts that survive of how it was used carry a quality that raises the hairs on the back of the neck. For the tradition tells that when attackers came to the town above, when raiders broke through the mud brick walls expecting plunder and captives and blood, they found the houses warm and the lamps still burning, and not a single soul anywhere. The bread perhaps still on the hearth, the water still in the jars, the ordinary business of life abandoned mid-gesture, as though the whole population had been lifted clean out of the world. The people had simply gone into the ground. They had slipped, family by family, through the doors behind their ovens and the hatches beneath their floors, and drawn the earth shut over their heads, and vanished, leaving the raiders to stand baffled in the empty glowing rooms, master of a town of ghosts. Standing in one of those low corridors today, with the desert heat sealed away behind meters of stone, and the air cool and still and faintly damp, one cannot help but feel the terror and the ingenuity woven together in this place. Every family a keeper of one secret, every kitchen a threshold to the underworld, a whole community that had rehearsed, over and over across the generations, the art of ceasing to exist. What must it have been to live so? To raise your children in a house whose floor was a lie, to teach them the way down as you'd been taught, to know that at any hour the horns might sound in the desert, and you would have to gather them and go into the dark. Reminiscent in its way of the mouches of Picardy, where the smoke of subterranean fires was threaded up through the hearths of surface cottages, so that no watcher could tell the hiding place from an ordinary village. But Uyi went further still, dividing not only its smoke but its very map among its people, so that the city could not be given away because no one alive had ever held it whole. The lamps of Nushabad still burned in the empty rooms above, the people were gone into the earth, and the enemy, cheated of everything, could only wonder where a whole town had fled. It is a picture that stays with the traveller, and it invites us, before we descend into any more of these hidden worlds, to step back and ask a larger question. Why here? Why there? Why do these cities of the deep appear where they appear, and not everywhere, and not nowhere? For the more of them we uncover, the clearer it becomes that they are not scattered at random across the surface of the earth. They cluster. They gather in certain places and shun others, and the places where they gather are not the safe corners of the world, but its most dangerous crossroads. The corridors down which empires marched. The borderlands where one civilization ground against another. The zones where surface life became, for whole centuries at a stretch, simply unsurvivable. There is a word that might be coined for this: topophobia, the fear of a place, or better, the fear that a place learns and remembers. For fear, it turns out, has a geography, and the underground city is the map of it, written in stone. Look at where our journey has already taken us, and the pattern rises unmistakably out of the ground. The Cappadocian Plateau, where Derinkuyu sinks its 18 levels into the tuff, is not a remote sanctuary but a highway, the great land bridge of Anatolia, across which army after army has poured for 4,000 years, Hittite and Phrygian, Persian and Greek and Roman, and above all the raiding columns of the Arab-Byzantine wars that swept back and forth across this open country between the 8th century and the 12th, driving the Christians of the region down into the earth season after season, generation after generation. To live on that plateau was to live on a road that armies used, and a road is no place to build a wall, so the people built downward instead. Turn to Picardy, and the same law holds. The chalk belt of northern France, soft and white and easily carved, underlies the flattest and most open country in all of Europe. And it is precisely that openness that has made it, for 2,000 years, the invasion corridor of the continent, the ground across which every conqueror bound for the heart of France or the plains of Flanders has had to pass. The Mouches of Naur were quarried first by Romans, then hollowed into refuge by villagers driven underground through the long agony of the 30 Years' War, and then, in our own century, scrawled with the names of soldiers who had come to that same soft chalk to fight and die upon the Somme. 3 layers of fear in the same white stone, because the surface of Picardy has never for long been a safe place to stand. The lowlands of Zhejiang, where the Longyou caverns wait in their drowned silence, tell it again in a different tongue. A fertile contested country in the warm and watered south of China, fought over through the whole long saga of the warring states and the dynasties that consumed them. A land where the rise and fall of kingdoms was measured in the burning of cities and the erasure of records. And the Iranian plateau, where Uyi hides beneath Nushabad, was for centuries the very hinge of the ancient world, the frontier where the Roman and Parthian, and then the Roman and Sassanid, empires met and clashed, the marchland between west and east across which the raiders of the steppe would later ride. Everywhere the pattern is the same. The underground cities gather where the surface is a battlefield that never quite goes quiet, where prosperity and danger are bound together, where the very things that make a place worth living in, water, farmland, a position on the great roads of trade, are the things that make it a target. They do not appear in the deep interiors, in the places too poor or too remote for armies to bother with. They appear at the crossroads, in the rich and the exposed and the fought-over lands, because it is there that human beings faced over and over across the centuries a choice that no wall could answer: to stay on the surface and be destroyed, or to go into the ground and endure. Fear built these places, not the passing fear of a single night, but the deep generational structural fear of peoples who had learned, through repeated and unbearable experience, that the surface of their world could not be trusted to hold. And so, the map of the underground cities is a map of that lesson, etched into the most dangerous ground on earth by the people who had no better choice. It is the cartography of fear. And yet, for our journey has taught us to distrust any pattern that closes too neatly. Not every descent into the rock is a flight from the world above. There is at least one great city that carved downward not to hide from its enemies, but to master the very thing that threatened its existence. And it lies to the south and west of the Iranian plateau, in the pink sandstone canyons of what is now southern Jordan. It is called Petra, and it is famous across the whole world for what stands in its light rather than what hides in its dark, for the rose-red facades of its tombs, carved directly into the cliff face, glowing at dawn and dusk with a colour that seems to come from within the stone itself. But beneath and behind those famous fronts lies another Petra, a lower world less celebrated but no less astonishing, and it complicates everything our journey has so far believed. The Nabateans who built Petra were a people of the desert, and their capital flourished from the 4th century before our era to the 1st century of it, growing rich and populous, home, by careful estimate, to somewhere between 25 and 40,000 souls, in a place that by every rule of nature should have supported almost no one at all. For Petra receives, in an average year, something on the order of 80 to 150 millimeters of rain, a desert's ration, a scant handful of storms that come, when they come, in sudden violent torrents down the canyons and are gone. To build a city of tens of thousands in such a place is to defy the land itself, and the Nabateans defied it not with walls or armies but with water, with an obsessive, brilliant, all-consuming mastery of every drop that fell within their reach. Here the descent into the rock served a purpose we have not yet met. the Nabateans carved downward not for refuge but for hydraulics, a subterranean and half-subterranean world of rock-cut channels, ceramic pipelines and hidden cisterns, a network reckoned at some 30 miles in total length, threading through the sandstone to catch, guide, store, and purify the precious and fleeting rain. They understood gravity and used it, running their water down long gentle gradients so that it flowed without pumps across the whole city. They understood that water carries silt and filth, and they built particle-settling basins into their channels, chambers where the flow slowed and the sediment sank, so that what emerged at the far end came clean, comparable in its ingenuity to the water engineering of Rome, though achieved by a desert people in a canyon that Rome would not conquer until the Nabatean age was already ending. The full ambition of this lower world was revealed by the archaeologist Leanne Badal, who began excavating in the heart of Petra in 1998, in an area long known simply as the Lower Market. What she uncovered there was no market at all, but a monumental garden and pool complex, a great ornamental swimming pool, 43 metres by 23, with an island pavilion rising at its centre, fed by the very aqueducts and channels that the Nabateans had carved through the surrounding stone. And here the meaning of all that hydraulic labour turns unexpectedly outward. For this was not merely water for survival. This was water for display, water as spectacle, water as a statement of power. A pool the size of a modern one glittering in the middle of one of the driest inhabited canyons on Earth, so that any visiting dignitary, any envoy or trader or rival king brought before the Nabatean court would understand at a single glance that here was a people who could summon abundance out of the desert itself. Conspicuous consumption, in the truest sense, the flaunting of the one thing the desert cannot give to those who knew exactly how impossible it was. Badal's description of the island pavilion at the pool centre lingers in the mind, for it is a picture of a civilization entirely at ease with its own mastery. The pavilion, she notes, had doors on all four sides, so that whoever sat within could see anyone approaching from any direction, a design at once open and watchful. And around it, always, the sound of water, falling from the aqueduct above into the pool below, a constant liquid music that filled the garden and gave the pavilion a strange privacy, its conversations veiled beneath the endless plash and murmur of the very substance that made the whole marvel possible. To sit there, in the green heart of a garden that had no business existing, surrounded by the sound of falling water in a land where rain came only a few days in the year, was to sit at the summit of an achievement, a triumph not of concealment, but of command. And so Petra unsettles the neat cartography we've just drawn. The underground is an archive of fear, yes, it is a place of last resort, of vanishing, of the divided map and the sealed door. But it is also, here in the Nabatean canyons, a place of triumph, a descent into the rock made not to flee the world's hostility, but to overcome it, to turn the very hardness and dryness of the stone into the source of life and the theatre of power. Sometimes, it seems, a people goes underground not to hide from what threatens them, but to solve it, to reach down into the earth and wrest from it the thing that will let them live, and more than live, flourish, in a place that ought to have killed them. The question our journey has carried from the beginning grows more complicated with every mile. We have asked who dug these places and what they were hiding from, but standing in the green ghost of Petra's garden, with the desert pressing at every gate, we must add another question to the list, for sometimes the answer is that they were hiding from nothing at all, and building instead a paradise out of stone. And yet even a paradise keeps its secrets, and the stones of Petra have proven again and again remarkably good at keeping them. For all its openness, all its theatre of water and light, the canyon has never revealed itself fully to those who study it. It hoards, it withholds. And nowhere was this more startlingly demonstrated than in the year 2016, when two archaeologists, Sarah Parkeck and Christopher Tuttle, announced that they had found, in the very heart of one of the most heavily documented ancient cities on Earth, a monument that no one had ever recorded. Not a chamber, not a channel, a structure the size of an Olympic swimming pool, sitting in plain daylight and yet somehow invisible for the better part of 2 centuries of modern exploration. Consider how strange that is. Petra has been drawing travellers, artists, mapmakers, and archaeologists since the Swiss explorer who first brought word of it back to Europe in the early 19th century. Its facades have been photographed 10 million times. Its tombs have been numbered, measured, catalogued, and catalogued again. Whole careers have unfolded within its walls. And still, half a mile south of the city centre, beneath a scatter of terrace walls that looked for all the world like the ordinary agricultural terracing of the surrounding hills, there lay a vast ceremonial platform that the eye had simply refused to see. It measures 184 feet by 161, a great outer enclosure, and within it a smaller paved interior platform, and rising upon that, a building some 28 feet on each side, facing, it seems, toward the city it overlooked. Pottery gathered from the surface suggests it dates to the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era, which is to say, to the very dawn of Petra's monumental age, among the oldest deliberate constructions the Nabateans ever raised. How does a monument of that scale hide for so long? The answer, when it came, was almost embarrassing in its simplicity. It hid by looking like something else. The great platform's walls, softened and slumped by 2,000 years of weather, resembled nothing more than the low field terraces that quilt these hillsides, the humble stonework of farmers, not the ceremonial architecture of kings. And so the eye, trained to expect grandeur only in the carved facades and the towering tombs, slid right over it. Christopher Tuttle himself put the matter with disarming honesty. He had known, he said, that something was there, and he was not alone. Other archaeologists, men and women who had worked in Petra for the last, in his words, God knows how many years, 100 at the very least, had noticed it too. There was a sense of something, a shape at the edge of perception, a wrongness in the landscape that the mind registered but could not name. It took the cold, indifferent eye of an orbiting satellite, infrared imaging, drone photography, and patient ground survey to see through the disguise the centuries had draped across it, and to say at last, here is a building, and no one made a record of it, and no one knows what it was for. But the truly telling part of the story is what happened next, which is to say, almost nothing. The platform was announced, it was described, it was photographed from above and paced across on foot, and then it was left, very largely alone. For here we arrive at a difficulty that shadows every discovery in this canyon, and it is not a difficulty of geology or engineering, but of ownership. Petra is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the most treasured places on the entire planet, and the Jordanian Department of Antiquities maintains strict and jealous control over every trowel that touches its soil. Nothing is dug here casually, nothing is opened without permission passing through many hands. And this is not bureaucratic obstruction, it is stewardship, born of hard experience with a century of foreign excavators who came, took, and left. But it means that a monument the size of a small town square can be found, and then simply wait, unexcavated, its purpose sealed inside it, while the questions it raises hang unanswered in the desert air, and the questions are considerable. Why build a great ceremonial platform half a mile from the city's heart? Was it a temple, a place of assembly, a stage for some rite whose meaning has entirely vanished? Why does it face the city, as though watching it? And how many more such structures lie beneath the terraces of Petra, disguised as farmland, waiting for an eye patient enough or a technology sharp enough to strip away their camouflage? The stone does not say. It holds its silence, as it has held it for 2 millennia, and now that silence is protected not only by weather and forgetting, but by law, by policy, by the tangled competing claims of a modern nation. For this is the deeper truth the buried platform reveals. that underground space and hidden space is never neutral ground. It is always contested ground. In Petra, the interest layer as densely as the strata themselves. There is national heritage, the pride of a kingdom in the marvel that sits at its centre. There is tourism, the revenue that flows through the sick each morning with the crowds, upon which livelihoods depend. And there is the older claim, the human claim, for these canyons were never truly empty. The Badul, a Bedouin people, have lived among Petra's tombs and caves for generations, sheltering in the very chambers the Nabateans carved, tending their goats where kings once processed. When a site is protected, someone is moved. When a monument is opened, someone's grazing land becomes an excavation. Every question posed to the stone is also a question posed to the living, and the living do not always agree. And so much of Petra's history remains quite deliberately buried, not lost exactly, but held in reserve, kept beneath the surface by the very care taken to preserve it. One cannot help but feel the irony. The Nabateans built to endure, and endure they did, and now their endurance is guarded so carefully that it may never fully speak. The platform waits, the desert keeps its counsel, and the eye that finally saw through the disguise can only stand at the edge of the enclosure and wonder what lies within the paved heart of it, sealed by nothing more than the reluctance of the present to disturb the past. From this canyon of contested ground and guarded secrets, our journey carries us across an ocean and a hemisphere, to another high place where stone was worked with impossible care, and where the earth beneath a city is said to remember passages that the surface world has spent 4 centuries trying to forget. We travel west and south, across the Atlantic, up into the thin, cold air of the Andes, to the ancient navel of a vanished empire, to Cusco, in the highlands of Peru, where the mountains hold a legend of tunnels that the mountains have only recently begun to confirm. To stand in Cusco is to stand upon a palimpsest of stone. Beneath the colonial arcades and the red-tiled roofs, beneath the churches and the plazas, run the foundations of the Inca capital. Walls of dressed andesite fitted so tightly that a blade cannot slide between the blocks. Walls that have shrugged off earthquakes that toppled everything the Spanish built above them. And beneath even those walls, the people of Cusco have always insisted run the chincanas, a word from the Quechua tongue meaning labyrinth, or more darkly, the place where one gets lost. Subterranean passages, stone-lined, threading through the bedrock of the sacred city, connecting its holiest and most powerful sites. For centuries, these tunnels were dismissed by scholars as folklore, the imaginings of a conquered people, the wishful memory of a greatness driven underground. And for centuries, the people of Cusco went on insisting that they were real. The written record, such as it is, reaches back to the very first generation after the conquest. In the 16th century, the Spanish chronicler Pedro Sarmiento de Gamboa described underground passages used during the ceremonies of the Inca royalty, secret ways along which the sacred and the powerful might move unseen. Another chronicler, Garcilaso de la Vega, the son of an Inca noblewoman and a Spanish conquistador, wrote of them too, weaving them into his great account of his mother's people. And an anonymous Jesuit, writing in 1594, set down a description of a tunnel running beneath the residence of the bishop himself, a passage of the old world running directly under the seat of the new religion, as though the conquered earth refused to yield its hidden roads even to God's own representatives. But here the modern seeker must proceed with care, for these accounts, tantalizing as they are not neutral witnesses. They were written by Spaniards or by the Spanish educated, and they served purposes of their own, to interpret Inca history through a European lens, to fit the marvels of the Andes into a frame the conquerors could understand, and sometimes to justify what the conquerors had done. Colonial text is motivated text. It tells us that something was believed to exist. It does not on its own tell us that it did. And the oral tradition, older still and passed mouth to mouth across the generations, carries its own colouring. In the folklore of Cusco, the chincanas are perilous places, and the stories that cluster around them are stories of disappearance. Explorers who entered, the tales say, never returned. The tunnels swallow those who venture into them. They are the place where one gets lost, and lostness is their whole meaning. Whether this is memory or warning or myth, no one can finally say. But the persistence of the fear is itself a kind of evidence, a shape in the collective mind that points, however imperfectly, at something real in the rock below. The most famous of these stories, and the one that has done more than any other to keep the legend alive, belongs to the 20th century. In 1923, an explorer remembered as Pablito Zárate is said to have entered a tunnel. One account places its mouth in the palace of an Inca prince, and to have descended into the dark. Days passed. His companions, or the authorities, or the townsfolk waited. And then, the legend says, he emerged, not in Cusco at all, but far to the south, near the ancient ruins of Tiwanaku, on the shores of Lake Titicaca, across what is now the border into Bolivia. Hundreds of miles travelled underground through passages carved by hands unknown. The claim is entirely unverified. No document confirms it. No independent witness can be produced. It has all the shape of a tale grown taller with each retelling, and yet it resonates, does it not? It resonates because it answers, in the only language folklore has, a question the surface world cannot. How far do the tunnels go? And what did the people who dug them intend? The story says, farther than you can imagine. The story says, to the very heart of the old sacred geography, from the navel of the empire to the place where the Inca believed the world itself had been born. For a long time that was all there was. Chronicle and legend, text and tale, each of them compromised, each of them motivated, none of them conclusive. And then, in the early months of the year 2025, the mountains began to answer. A team of archaeologists led by Jorge Calero Flores and Mildred Fernandez Palomino turned upon the bedrock of Cusco the instruments of the modern age, ground-penetrating radar and acoustic prospecting, sound sent down into the stone to listen for the hollow places where sound behaves differently, and the stone answered. Beneath the streets of the ancient capital, the surveys traced a network of passages running roughly 1,750 metres, the better part of 2 kilometres of subterranean corridor, connecting the two most sacred and powerful places in the Inca world. At one end, the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, the golden heart of the empire, where the walls were once sheathed in plates of gold and a garden of gold and silver plants glittered in the courtyard. At the other, Sacsayhuaman, the vast fortress sanctuary above the city, its terraces built of stone so enormous that the legends of their moving rival any in the ancient world. Between these two poles of Inca power ran the tunnel, real, measurable, mapped at last by machines that do not dream and do not lie. The passages, the surveys revealed, lie close beneath the surface, typically between 1.5 and 2.5 metres down, near enough that generations must have walked over them without knowing, and where the instruments could infer the shape of them, that shape spoke unmistakably of Inca hands. Trapezoidal walls, that signature form of Andean architecture, wider at the base than the top, splayed to shrug off the earthquakes that shake this land, and carved stone beams spanning the tops of the corridors. This is not the profile of a natural cave, nor of a mine, nor of a colonial drain. This is deliberate architecture, built to the same aesthetic and the same engineering principles as the Great Walls above ground, carried down into the dark. Dr. Calero, standing at the threshold between legend and fact, put the matter plainly. This isn't a fantasy, he said. We have both historical documentation and scientific evidence. What we're uncovering is real. Real, and yet still guarded, still withheld. For the tunnels, though now confirmed, remain very largely closed to the public. Their function is still an open question. Whether they served ritual, moving the sacred and the royal unseen beneath the city, as Sarmiento de Gamboa had claimed. Whether they served logistics, a hidden way to move goods or messages or people through the capital. Whether they served defense, an escape route or a secret line of movement in time of siege. The excavation is ongoing. The answers are not yet in. And here the researchers add a detail that darkens the whole picture and drags us out of the world of ritual and into the world of power and its cruelties. Some of the original entrances to the chincanas, they note, were sealed, deliberately, permanently, in the 19th century, and sealed not with rubble or masonry but with explosives. Someone at some point wanted these passages shut, and shut so thoroughly that they blasted the mouths of them closed rather than merely blocking them. The place where one gets lost was made by human hands into a place one could not enter at all. Who would do such a thing, and why? To answer that, we must look back past the dynamite of the 19th century to an earlier and more systematic campaign of sealing, for the closing of the Inca underworld did not begin with explosives. It began with priests and shovels 300 years before in the first fervent generations of Spanish rule. When the conquerors came to the Andes, they came not only with steel and horses, but with a theology, and that theology could not tolerate the sacred geography they found. To the Inca, the land itself was alive with holiness. Springs, stones, caves, mountain peaks, and the hidden passages beneath the earth. All of these were huacas, sacred things, places where the divine touched the world and where offerings were made and rites performed. And the underground, the world beneath, held a particular power in the Andean imagination, a realm of ancestors and origins, of the dead and the unborn, a threshold between this world and the others. To the Spanish, all of this was idolatry, error, contrary to the gospel, to be rooted out. And rooted out they set themselves to do. In the decades that bracket the turn of the 17th century, roughly from the 1600s through the 1640s and beyond, the Church waged a sustained war against native belief that history remembers as the extirpation of idolatry. Its foot soldiers were priests and inspectors who travelled through the highlands seeking out the sacred places of the conquered and destroying them, smashing the idols, burning the offerings, and sealing the huacas. One of the most notorious of these men was the priest Francisco de Avila, whose campaigns in the early decades of the century became a model of the enterprise, to find where the old gods still lived in the land and to close those places forever. A manual printed for the use of priests in 1583, the Confessionario, set out the logic without flinching. It is necessary, it declares, to remove the errors contrary to the gospel that the infidels have. Removal, erasure, the deliberate unmaking of a sacred world, and the great symbol of that unmaking stands to this day in the centre of Cusco, where the Coricancha met its fate. The golden temple of the sun, the very heart from which the confirmed tunnels radiate, was stripped of its gold, and then, in an act of theological architecture more eloquent than any sermon, the Spanish raised directly upon its foundations the church of Santo Domingo. Stone for stone, the new faith planted itself atop the old, so that the God of the conquerors would stand upon the temple of the conquered sun. The Inca walls, too perfect and too enduring to remove, were kept as the base. The Christian church rose from them like a graft upon living wood. And the tunnels, the sacred passages running out from that holy place, some of them, the records suggest, were filled and sealed in the course of the colonial building, choked with rubble, blocked from use, cut off from the world of the living. Though not, it seems, all of them. Some passages, the historians note, remained untouched even as the great colonial landmarks rose above them. The Church of the Society of Jesus among them, built in the 1570s over the palace of an Inca ruler. The old roads endured beneath the new city, sealed here, forgotten there, surviving in the dark to be found again, 4 centuries on by radar and by sound. Here then, the political thread that has wound through this whole journey draws suddenly tight. Underground erasure, we begin to see, is not always the work of geology, of collapse and silting, and the patient forgetting of time. Sometimes it is a deliberate act, an act of power, of conquest, of one people sealing shut the underworld of another. The Nabatean platform waits unexcavated because a modern nation guards it with care. The chincanas were blasted shut in the 19th century and filled with rubble in the 17th because conquerors understood, as conquerors always have, that to truly master a people, you must master their sacred places, and that the most sacred places of the Andes lay in the dark below. There is something almost primal in it, this instinct to seal the enemy's underworld. as though the conquest of the surface were never quite enough, as though the victory could not be complete while the passages beneath still ran, still connected the temple to the fortress, still offered the vanished the possibility of moving unseen through the earth of their own stolen city. And so the descent that began as a study of fear and refuge has led us to a stranger place, to the recognition that the underground is not only where the frightened flee, and not only where the powerful flaunt their mastery, but where the conquered are followed, hunted, and finally shut in. The Spanish came with the gospel and the sword, and when the surface was theirs they came, at last, with shovels, to fill the holy passages, to seal the sacred caves, to bury the buried world one final time. Standing in Cusco today, on the pavement above the confirmed and silent Chincanas, one feels the full weight of that long ceiling pressing up from below. The tunnels are real. The radar has spoken. And yet they remain closed, guarded, half-excavated, their purpose still locked inside them, a network dug by a vanished empire sealed by its conquerors, and only now, 5 centuries later, beginning to yield the first faint echoes of what it was and why it was made, and who it was that laboured generation upon generation to carve these impossible roads into the living stone. Who laboured? It is a small phrase, and it slips easily past the ear, and yet it may be the largest question this entire journey has yet asked. For behind every one of these sites, behind the 85 metres of Derinkuyu, behind the 1,000,000 cubic metres hollowed from Phoenix Hill, behind the vast fitted stones of Sacsayhuaman rising above Cusco, there stands an unseen multitude, hands that gripped chisels and dragged baskets, backs bent for years, for decades, for lifetimes. And when we try to count those hands to measure the sheer human effort that these places demanded, the numbers grow strange and vertiginous, and a new mystery opens beneath the ones we've already walked through. A mystery not of stone, but of people, not of what was carved, but of who carved it, and how so many were commanded and fed and organised, and then so utterly forgotten. Consider first the arithmetic of Derinkuyu. To carve a city of 18 levels down through 85 metres of volcanic tuff, to open the chambers and the stables and the wine presses and the churches, to bore the 50 ventilation shafts and sink the wells and thread the puzzle tunnels between them all, the diggers had to remove, by careful modern estimate, something on the order of 55,000 cubic metres of rock. 55,000 cubic metres. It is a figure the mind cannot easily hold, and so let us try to make it real. That is not a chamber, that is not a warren, that is a volume of stone equivalent to a small hill, lifted out of the earth basket by basket, hauled up shaft after shaft and carried away to somewhere. And here the first quiet oddity presents itself. For where exactly did 55,000 cubic metres of excavated tuff go? The soft rock, once carved and exposed to the air, hardens. It does not vanish. Yet the landscape above Derinkuyu bears no obvious mountain of spoil, no telltale heaps to match the hollow below. The rock was removed and dispersed and lost to the eye, and even in this smallest of details, the underground keeps its secrets. Now turn east again, to the Longyou grottos, and the arithmetic swells to something almost incomprehensible. Not 55,000 cubic metres, but roughly 1,000,000. 1,000,000 cubic metres of siltstone chiselled out of Fenghuang Hill and carried away, leaving 24 vast caverns and, as we have seen, not a single tool, not a single fragment of documentation, not a single line in the annals of any dynasty to say that the work was ever done. The archaeologist Liu Weijin, standing before that void, reached for the only comparison grand enough to contain it, and found it in the Great Pyramid, reckoning that to accomplish such a thing you would need something like 1,000 workers, labouring continuously for 6 years. 1,000 people, 6 years. And yet even that staggering estimate its own author was quick to admit might fall short of the truth. As one researcher put it plainly, the workload could far exceed the theoretical estimate. because the raw figure counts only the volume of rock and says nothing of the precision, nothing of the uniform parallel chisel marks that sheathe every surface at their patient 60-degree angle, nothing of the geometry that had to be planned and held and executed flawlessly across all that darkness. To move 1,000,000 cubic meters is one labour. To move it beautifully, to move it to a tolerance of 0.5 centimetre across 30,000 square metres is another labour entirely, and one for which our estimates have no honest measure. And then there is Sacsayhuaman, rising in tiers above the Inca capital, where the challenge shifts from the volume removed to the weight moved. For here the astonishment is not the emptying of a hill, but the raising of one, the assembly of megalithic walls from stones that weigh 90 tons, 125 tons, and by some estimates 200, 300, even 360 tons apiece. Stones fitted together in that famous ashlar masonry so tight, so seamless, that no mortar was ever needed and no blade can slide between them, and these are only the survivors. The chroniclers record that the Spanish dismantled much of Sacsayhuaman to build their colonial city, carting away the smaller movable blocks to raise churches and mansions in Cusco below, leaving behind only the heaviest, the immovable, the giants too vast to steal. What stands today, in other words, is the fraction the conquerors could not carry off. The wall we marvel at is the remnant. The whole, when it stood complete, must have been a thing beyond our present power to imagine, and every one of those titanic stones was quarried, shaped, transported across the Andean terrain, and lifted into place by human hands and human ingenuity, without draft animals capable of the task, without the wheel, without iron, without any of the machinery that modern engineers would consider indispensable. Set these three numbers side by side. 55,000 cubic meters removed at Derinkuyu, 1,000,000 at Longyou, 360 tons in a single stone at Sacsayhuaman, and a single question rises up from all of them at once. Who commanded this? For work on such a scale does not simply happen. It cannot be the accident of scattered individuals digging as the mood takes them. To hollow a city or raise a fortress of this magnitude, some society had to marshal thousands of workers and direct them, over years and often over generations, toward a single unwavering design. Those workers had to be fed while they laboured, which means agriculture and storage and distribution organised to sustain them. They had to be housed and clothed and their efforts coordinated. This gallery here, that shaft there, this stone to that precise position, and no other. In a word, each of these places implies a command economy, a centralised authority powerful enough and patient enough to bend the labour of a population toward a purpose that would not be finished in the lifetime of those who began it. And here is where the ground truly falls away beneath us, because such a command economy leaves records. It always has. The pyramids of Egypt come to us wrapped in administrative papyri, ration lists, the names of work gangs scrawled on stone, the accounts of overseers and the logistics of grain. The great works of Mesopotamia arrive accompanied by clay tablets tallying every measure of barley and every day of corvée labour. Bureaucracy is the shadow that monumental labour casts, and yet at Longyou that shadow is simply absent. 1,000,000 cubic metres of stone, 1,000 workers for 6 years or more, and not one word survives in the vast and meticulous records of Chinese history to say that any of it took place. The Han kept archives, the Zhou kept archives, and of this, the equal of a pyramid, sunk into a hillside in Zhejiang, they say nothing whatsoever. It is as though the mobilization happened in a silence so complete that it swallowed even the memory of the mobilizers. So we are left, as we so often are on this journey, with a fork in the dark, and neither path is comfortable. Either the records existed and were destroyed, deliberately, as we've already wondered in the case of Longyou, perhaps in the great burnings and purges by which conquering dynasties erased the memory of what came before, or else, and this is the stranger possibility, the one that unsettles our very assumptions, these societies organised labour on a colossal scale in ways that our documentary evidence simply cannot yet see. Ways that left no papyri, no tablets, no ledgers, because they did not run on ledgers. The Inca, famously, kept their accounts not in writing at all, but in the knotted cords of the quipu, a system of record that the Spanish, in their zeal, largely destroyed and which we can still only partially read. How much administrative memory, how many labour rolls and grain tallies vanished when those cords were burned as instruments of idolatry? How many other peoples kept their reckonings in forms we no longer recognise as reckoning at all, in mediums that rot, in oral traditions that died with their last speaker, in systems so alien to the paper and ink assumptions of the modern archive that we walk past their traces without knowing what we see? Could it be that the true scale of these projects is precisely what has hidden them? That a labour so vast, so total, so woven into the fabric of a whole society required no separate record because everyone alive already knew, and that when those societies collapsed, or were conquered, or simply forgot, the knowing died with them, leaving only the impossible hollow, the impossible wall, the impossible million cubic meters removed by a workforce that history declines to name. Yet for all the wonder of the digging, for all the mystery of the labour that emptied these hills and raised these stones, the true genius of the underground city may not lie in the excavation at all. It may lie in something far subtler, far harder, and far easier to overlook, for a hole in the ground, however vast, is only a tomb until you can breathe inside it. The supreme achievement of these builders was not the carving of the void, it was the mastery of the air. Return for a moment to Derinkuyu and look up. There, above you, running the full plunging height of the city, rise the ventilation shafts, more than 50 of them, some reaching 55 metres toward the surface, some deeper still, and they are not simple air holes punched through the rock as an afterthought. They are the very organs of the city, the lungs and the arteries both, for these same shafts that carried fresh air down to the lowest levels also served, at their base, as wells, drawing water from the aquifer far below. Air and water threaded through a single ingenious system, so that even sealed behind the rolling stones, even shut off from the world for weeks at a time, 20,000 people and their livestock could breathe and drink in the deep dark. This is engineering of a very high order. The recognition that to shelter a multitude underground you must solve not one problem but three at once. The problem of air, the problem of water, and the problem of temperature, and that they must all be solved together, in balance, and held in balance indefinitely. And the builders solved them with a discipline that extended even to the choice of fuel. For if you must live below, and cook below, and warm yourself below, then smoke is your enemy, both because it fouls the precious air within, and because rising from the shafts it betrays your hidden city to the very enemies you have descended to escape. And so, the evidence suggests, the inhabitants of these deep refuges burned dry fuel by design, dry dung, charcoal, the cleanest burning materials they could find, chosen to minimize the smoke that would gather in the corridors or plume from the vents. They lit their darkness, some accounts hold, with lamps of linseed oil, which burned with almost no visible exhaust. Think of the care in that. Think of the accumulated understanding it represents, that fire underground is not the same as fire above, that the wrong flame will poison you or expose you, that even the light by which you see must be chosen for its breath. This is not the improvisation of the desperate. This is a mature technology of subterranean living, refined over generations of practice, encoding 1,000 hard-learned lessons about how to keep a void alive. Travel again to Nushabad, to the labyrinth of Uyi beneath the Iranian desert, and the mastery of air grows even more refined. There, in that Sasanian city of cold sweet water, the designers did not merely bore vertical shafts and trust to the rising of warm air. They played the physics of pressure with a subtlety that would not disgrace a modern ventilation engineer. They angled their shafts. They set some vertical and some inclined, arranging them so that the movement of air across the surface openings and the difference in pressure between one shaft and another would draw a natural draft through the passages. The Venturi effect, the very principle by which a narrowing channel accelerates a flowing fluid, exploited here in the fabric of the earth itself, centuries upon centuries before it bore any name. The result was a city that breathed on its own, without bellows, without fans, without any mechanism at all. A constant, silent, self-sustaining circulation of air drawn through 3 distinct subterranean layers by nothing but the cleverness of geometry and the eternal restlessness of the wind above. Standing in those angled channels today, one cannot help but feel the faint, patient movement of the air upon the skin, and know that it is moving because someone 1500 years ago understood precisely how to make it move. And then, most wondrous of all, there is Longyou, where the mastery of the invisible reaches its quiet summit. For these 24 caverns, carved into their siltstone more than 2,000 years ago, do something that ought to be impossible for a man-made void of such age and scale. They hold their climate. Without any mechanical intervention whatsoever, without vents contrived or ducts maintained, the grottos sustain a stable temperature, cited most often at somewhere near 15 to 18 degrees, and a high, constant humidity, hovering by many accounts around 95%. Season after season, century after century, while the world above swings from the heat of summer to the cold of winter, the interior of Phoenix Hill remains almost changeless, cool, damp, still, and structurally sound. And this is not the accident of a lucky hole. It is, the researchers believe, the direct consequence of the cavern's precise geometry, of the deliberate proportions of their pillars and walls and vaults, working in concert with the insulating properties of the surrounding rock to create a microclimate as stable as any climate-controlled vault a modern engineer could build. The very precision that so baffles us at Longyou, the uniform marks, the geometric discipline, the impossible tolerances, may itself be part of how the caves breathe. Form and function fused into one, so that the beauty of the carving is also the mechanism of its survival. And so we arrive at a truth that overturns the emphasis of our whole descent. We came seeking the wonder of the digging, the depth, the volume, the sheer heroic labour of hollowing the earth. But the deeper marvel, the higher achievement, was never the carving of the void. It was the making of the void habitable, the invisible, ceaseless management of air and water and warmth that turned a tomb-like emptiness into a living home. Any people, given hands and time and desperation enough, might dig a hole. Only a people of profound and hard-won understanding could dig a hole in which a nation might breathe for 1,000 years. The city was a marvel of planning, but its survival depended on the invisible, on the constant, silent exchange of air that no visitor sees and no photograph records. That is the true engineering peak of the underground world, not the stone that was removed, but the breath that was kept, which makes what happened next all the more inexplicable. For here we come to the great dark heart of this entire journey, the question toward which every site has been quietly pointing, the enigma that has waited beneath all the others, and it must now be stated plainly and at full force. This knowledge, this mastery, this deep and sophisticated art of subterranean urbanism does not carry forward. It stops, everywhere and abruptly and forever. Watch the pattern assemble across the map. In Cappadocia, the great flowering of underground construction, the expansion of Longyou and its sister cities to their full extent, belongs above all to the Byzantine centuries, that long era of Arab-Byzantine conflict when the raids came season after season and the people descended to survive them. The primary period of that expansion runs, by the archaeological reckoning, from around the 8th century into the 12th, and though the cities were still used sporadically for many centuries after, right down, as we have seen, to the population exchange of 1923, the high age of their making draws to a close around the 13th century and is never renewed. In China, the Longyou grottos date to roughly 200 years before the Common Era, the twilight of the Zhou and the dawn of the Han, and then nothing. No successor caverns. No tradition of such carving continuing down the dynasties. The technique appears, achieves perfection, and falls silent so completely that not even a memory of it survives in the records. And in Petra, the Nabatean genius for rock-cut monumentality, for the carving of those great facades from the living cliff, begins its decline after the Roman annexation of the year 106, as the trade routes that fed the city's wealth shifted away. And by the 3rd century of the Common Era, the age of great new construction has effectively ended. 3 sites, 3 continents, 3 separate peoples with no contact between them, and in each the same arc, a rise into mastery, a period of astonishing achievement, and then an ending that closes and does not reopen. No tradition of deep rock-cut urbanism carries forward into the modern world. There is no unbroken line of underground builders passing their craft from generation to generation down to the present day. The knowledge that raised Derinkuyu and hollowed Longyou and faced the cliffs of Petra flares up, burns brilliantly, and is extinguished, and we are left once more at a fork with 3 paths, each of them plausible, none of them proven, all of them held open. Perhaps the knowledge was simply lost. The specialized skills of a large-scale, stable subterranean excavation never passed down, because the particular social order or religious hierarchy that had commissioned them collapsed and took the craft into the grave with it. When the patron dies, the art can die too, and the masters, having no one to build for, take their understanding to their own tombs. Or perhaps the knowledge was suppressed, deliberately obscured or abandoned as the paradigms of the surface shifted, as new powers and new faiths arose that had no use for the old underground world and every reason to seal it, as we have watched the Spanish seal Cusco and the burnings threaten Longyou. Or perhaps, most soberingly of all, nothing was lost or suppressed at all. Perhaps the technique vanished for the simplest of reasons, that the terrible pressures which had demanded it, the endless raids, the existential fear, the climate-driven desperation that drove whole peoples beneath the ground, at last relented and never again returned at a scale that would justify so vast and dreadful a labour. Perhaps we stopped digging cities into the earth because mercifully we no longer had to. Which of the 3 is true? Was it the death of the masters, the malice of the conquerors, or the mere fading of the fear? Could it be that all 3 played their part in different places and different centuries, converging on the single strange fact that the deepest builders of the ancient world left no heirs? These are not mere collections of caverns, one researcher reminds us. They are thought-out, planned settlements, the products of deliberate and sophisticated design, and their disappearance from the record of human skill is not a small thing to explain away. Something rose in the dark, achieved a mastery we are only now beginning to measure, and then went silent across the whole face of the earth. And standing above any one of them today, one feels the enormity of that silence pressing up through the soles of one's feet, the sense of a knowledge that lived and worked and vanished, leaving behind only these impossible hollows in the stone and the question of who will ever dig this way again and why they never did. And yet, if the knowledge truly vanished, if no unbroken lineage carried the art of deep earth construction from one generation to the next, from one civilization to another, then a question rises that is perhaps more unsettling than the silence itself. How do we explain the similarities? How do we account for the fact that underground cities separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years share not merely the impulse to descend, but specific architectural solutions, specific defensive geometries, specific relationships between ventilation, water, and depth that suggest something more disciplined than coincidence, and more structured than parallel invention? The 3 paths we have followed, the death of the masters, the malice of the conquerors, the fading of the fear, each assumes that the knowledge belonged to a place, rooted in its own soil, growing from its own necessity. But there is a 4th possibility, one that a number of scholars have begun to articulate with increasing care, and it leads us away from the local and towards something itinerant, something mobile, something that moves. Consider the medieval cathedral. Not the building itself, but the process by which it came into being. In the 12th and 13th centuries across Western Europe, immense structures of cut stone rose in towns that had no prior tradition of monumental architecture, no local population with the skills to raise a vault 80 feet above the nave floor, no resident engineering class capable of calculating the thrust of a flying buttress. The cathedrals were not built by the towns that housed them. They were built by lodges, itinerant guilds of master masons, stonecutters and engineers who travelled from site to site, from patron to patron, carrying their knowledge not in written manuals but in memory, in apprenticeship, in closely guarded oral tradition. The lodge arrived, built, trained a small local workforce for the duration, and when the work was done or the funding faltered, the lodge moved on to another bishop, another city, another commission, leaving behind a finished wonder and almost no documentation of how it had been achieved. The plans, such as they were, existed in the master's mind. The techniques were taught hand to hand, demonstrated on the scaffolding, corrected in real time. And when the age of cathedral building waned, when the Black Death thinned the guilds and the Reformation shifted patronage away from ecclesiastical grandeur, the lodges contracted, fragmented, and in many cases simply dissolved, their accumulated centuries of structural intuition scattering like dust on a wind that no longer blew toward heaven. The historian David Macaulay, in reconstructing the process of medieval cathedral construction, illuminated precisely this pattern, an extraordinary concentration of expertise that was not housed in any institution, not recorded in any archive, not anchored to any single place, but carried in the bodies and minds of a travelling elite whose existence left almost no trace beyond the buildings themselves. And it is this framework, the guild, the lodge, the itinerant master, that a number of researchers have begun to apply, cautiously but with growing conviction, to the underground cities of the ancient and pre-modern Near East. The proposal is deceptively simple. What if the underground cities were not built by the communities that sheltered in them, but for those communities, by specialists who arrived, excavated, engineered the ventilation and the drainage and the defensive doors, and then departed, taking their methods with them to the next commission, the next threatened settlement, the next patron willing to pay for survival? What if the blueprint for Derinku유's 18 levels was not conceived on the spot by Phrygian farmers or Byzantine monks, but carried in someone's head, a master digger, a guild elder, a figure whose title we will never know because it was never written down, and deployed according to a template refined over generations of practice in the dark? The evidence is circumstantial, as all evidence must be when the proposed actors are defined precisely by their refusal to leave written records. But the circumstantial weight is not trivial. Iranian scholars studying the underground refugees of the Central Plateau have noted something arresting about Nushabad. Its three-level plan, the arrangement of its passages, the placement of its ventilation shafts, the angles of its defensive corridors, the distribution of its concealed entrances is not unique. It is duplicated, almost exactly, in at least two other Iranian underground cities located roughly 400 kilometers apart. 400 kilometers of arid terrain, of mountain passes and desert crossings, separate these sites, and yet the architectural logic that governs them is so consistent, so precisely mirrored in its proportions and its defensive geometry, that the notion of independent invention strains credulity. These are not vaguely similar caves. They are variations on a theme so tightly composed that the theme itself must have existed before any individual variation was carved. A template, a plan, a design carried not on paper, for no paper survives, no drawing, no schematic, but in the disciplined memory of someone who had done this before and who knew exactly how deep to dig, how wide to cut the shafts, how sharply to angle the labyrinth so that a single defender could hold back a corridor of invaders. And if such a guild existed in Sassanid Iran, moving between settlements along the contested frontiers of an empire perpetually at war with Byzantium to the west and Central Asian raiders to the east, then the pattern begins to resolve not as a series of isolated miracles but as a tradition, oral, initiatory, jealously guarded, and therefore invisible to any archive that privileged the written word. The guild would explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated subterranean engineering in places that show no prior history of such work. It would explain the consistency of technique across distances that no farming community could have bridged. It would explain, most hauntingly of all, the disappearance. For when the guild ceases to travel, when the last master dies without training a successor, or when the political conditions that generated commissions shift and the patrons no longer call, then the knowledge does not fade gradually into a written record where fragments might be recovered. It simply stops. One day there is a man alive who knows how to carve a three-level refuge from the living rock, who carries in his memory the angles of the ventilation, the tolerances of the chisel work, the precise depth at which a shaft must terminate to reach clean water, without compromising the structural integrity of the level above, and the next day that man is dead, or old, or unwanted, and the knowledge dies with him, as completely as if it had never existed, leaving behind only the stone and the dark and the silence of a city that was never meant to be found again. This is the Guild hypothesis, and it transforms the question. We have asked throughout this long journey underground why the technique vanishes, but perhaps the deeper question is not why it vanishes, but how it ever travelled in the first place. How a design template born in one threatened valley found its way to another, 400 kilometres distant, without leaving a single footprint on the surface of the written record. The answer, if the hypothesis holds, is that the footprint was never meant to be left. The secrecy was not an accident of history, it was the method. Yet even the most sophisticated guild, the most mobile and disciplined tradition of underground engineering, does not conjure itself from nothing. Something calls it into being. Something creates the demand, the desperation, the willingness of an entire community to fund and feed and house a team of specialists for years while they hollow out the earth beneath the settlement. And when we look across the full span of sites we have visited, from the volcanic tuff of Cappadocia to the chalk of Picardy, from the siltstone of Zhejiang to the sandstone of Petra, from the limestone of Isfahan province to the andesite beneath Cusco, a single force emerges as the common architect. Not genius, not ambition, not the slow accumulation of craft for its own sake. Catastrophe. Every underground city we have entered is a monument to a specific catastrophe, a named and datable wave of destruction that swept across the surface and drove the living into the earth. The pattern is so consistent, so ruthlessly repeated across millennia and continents, that it begins to feel less like a coincidence and more like a law written not in the language of engineering but in the language of terror. In Anatolia, the earliest deep excavations in the volcanic tuff may trace their origins to the great unravelling that archaeologists call the Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 years before the Common Era. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated central Anatolia for centuries, fragmented under a cascade of pressures: drought, famine, the disruption of trade networks, the arrival of populations displaced from collapsing states to the west and south. The collapse was not a single event, but a slow-motion disintegration, a century-long unwinding of the structures that had held civilization together across the eastern Mediterranean, and in its wake the peoples of the Anatolian plateau found themselves exposed, unprotected, facing a world in which the old powers that had guaranteed a measure of order were simply gone. If the earliest underground refugees in Cappadocia date to this period, and the evidence, though fragmentary, points in that direction, then the very first descents into the tuff were not acts of architectural ambition, but acts of desperate improvisation, the scratching of shelter into the one material that would yield to hand tools while remaining strong enough to hold a roof above the heads of the frightened. And the pattern deepens with each subsequent catastrophe. The Arab-Byzantine wars of the 7th through 11th centuries, the seasonal raids that swept across the Anatolian frontier year after year, generation after generation, drove the expansion of Derinkuyu and its sister cities into the vast multi-level refuges we have already explored. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century, swift, annihilating, unstoppable on the open steppe, emptied the surface villages of Cappadocia for the last great period of underground habitation, pushing communities deeper and longer into the earth than any previous threat had demanded. In Iran, the Sassanid Empire's centuries-long confrontation with Byzantium to the west, and with Central Asian raiding cultures to the northeast, created exactly the conditions under which Nushabad and its sister refugees became necessary, not as architectural experiments but as instruments of survival for the most vulnerable members of the community: the women, the children, the elderly, those who could not fight and could not flee fast enough across open ground. The underground city was not a choice. It was the last option remaining when every other option had been tried and had failed. And in Cusco, the catastrophe wore a different face but spoke the same language. The Spanish conquest of the 16th century did not merely defeat the Inca state. It sought to erase the spiritual and ceremonial infrastructure that had given that state its meaning. The Chinkana tunnels, confirmed now by radar beneath the streets of the modern city, were sealed not by earthquake or neglect, but by deliberate human action, by the campaign of extirpation that sought to close every passage, block every entrance, and sever the connection between the Inca world above and whatever sacred geography lay below. The catastrophe here was not a raid to be weathered and survived. It was a conquest that intended permanence, and the sealing of the tunnels was not a defensive act by those who had built them, but an offensive act by those who had conquered them. The underground world of Cusco did not fall silent because the threat passed. It fell silent because the conquerors reached in and closed its mouth. Catastrophe, then, is the true architect. Not the hand that carved the stone, but the force that placed the chisel in that hand and said, "Dig or die." And if catastrophe is the architect, then the disappearance of the technique requires no mysterious explanation at all. The technique vanishes when the catastrophe relents, or when the catastrophe succeeds so completely that there is no one left to dig. The guild ceases to travel not because its knowledge is lost in some romantic twilight of forgotten wisdom, but because no one is calling for its services, because the raids have stopped, or the borders have stabilized, or the empire has consolidated its hold so thoroughly that the old refugees beneath the kitchen floors are no longer needed and begin, slowly, to fill with dust and silence and forgetting. And it is into that forgetting that the last diggers descend, not the ancient builders, not the guild masters, not the frightened families clutching their children in the dark, but the ordinary people of the 20th century who stumbled, without warning and without preparation, into the compressed silence of their ancestors' terror. In 1963, in the small town of Derinkuyu in central Turkey, a man was renovating his basement. The work was domestic, practical, unremarkable. The kind of thing done on a weekend with simple tools and a modest ambition to gain a few extra feet of storage. He noticed a gap in his wall, a place where the plaster did not sit quite right, where the chickens he kept seemed to vanish and reappear as if passing through the stone itself. He knocked through the wall, and behind it, where there should have been nothing but packed earth and the foundations of neighbouring houses, there was a tunnel, and beyond the tunnel, a room, and beyond the room, another tunnel, and another room, and another, descending level by level into a darkness so complete and so old that the air itself tasted of centuries. He had broken through into the uppermost level of an 18-story underground city that had sheltered 20,000 human beings and had been sealed, forgotten, and buried beneath the ordinary life of the town for generations. The chickens had found what the historians had not. 3 decades later, in June of 1992, 4 farmers in the village of Xi'an in Zhejiang province, China, decided to drain a pond. The pond had always been there, part of the village landscape, unremarkable except for a local tradition that held it to be bottomless, the kind of story told to keep children from swimming too far from shore. The farmers brought hand pumps. They expected mud, perhaps a few feet of silted water above a clay bottom. What they found, as the water level dropped and the pumps laboured and the hours turned into days, was that the pond was not a pond at all. It was the flooded entrance to a cavern, and not merely one cavern, but 24 vast hand-carved grottos cut from the siltstone of Phoenix Hill, their walls scored with uniform chisel marks, their ceilings soaring overhead in the torchlight, their scale so immense that an estimated 1 million cubic meters of stone had been removed by hands that left no record, no name, no explanation. The farmers stood in the first drain chamber and looked up at walls that had not been seen by human eyes in over 2,000 years, and the silence that greeted them was so total, so absolute, that it seemed less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something that had been waiting. And in 2006, in the Iranian city of Nushabad, a man was digging a sewage ditch beneath his kitchen floor. The work was as mundane as work can be, a problem of plumbing, of modern infrastructure meeting the packed earth of an old house. His shovel broke through into open air. He had fallen, or nearly fallen, into the uppermost level of Uyi. a 3-story Sassanid-era labyrinth that had served as a refuge for the most vulnerable members of the community during invasions that had swept across this land more than a millennium before he was born. The chamber he had opened was empty. No bones, no treasure, no inscription. Only the stone, shaped by hands that had known exactly what they were doing, and the darkness, and the cool, still air that rose from the levels below, like the exhalation of something that had been holding its breath for 1,500 years. What unites these 3 moments is not merely the accident of discovery, the broken wall, the drained pond, the cracked kitchen floor, but what was found, or rather, what was not found, in the spaces below. No bodies, no hoards of gold or silver, no dramatic artifacts that might explain, in a single revelatory object, why these cities existed and who had built them. Only the stone, only the architecture itself, mute and perfect and empty, as if the builders had intended not merely to leave, but to leave no trace of themselves behind, to erase their own presence from the refuge they had carved so that the refuge would outlast them in its purest form, a shell, a hollow, a negative space shaped by fear and skill, and then abandoned to the silence that is the only inheritance the underground world ever offers to those who come after. One feels, standing in any of these spaces, that the emptiness is not an absence but a message, that the stone remembers what the surface has forgotten, and that the darkness holds its secrets not out of malice, but out of a patience so vast that it can afford to wait another 1,000 years for someone to ask the right question. And perhaps the most unsettling thing about these rediscoveries is not that the spaces were hidden, but that they were hidden so well that the people living directly above them, cooking meals, raising children, keeping chickens, digging ditches, had no idea that beneath their feet lay the frozen architecture of an entire civilization's terror, silent, intact, and waiting in the dark for a wall to break, a pond to drain, a floor to give way, and let the light come flooding back into rooms that were never meant to see it again. And yet, for all that the underground world guards its silence, there are those who refuse to let it keep its secrets unchallenged. The stone may wait 1,000 years, but it does not always wait unobserved. For while the accidental discoveries, the broken wall, the drained pond, the cracked floor, have written the great chapters of this story so far, they are no longer the only way that light reaches these buried rooms. Something has changed in the way we listen to the earth. Where once we could only wait for the ground to give up its secrets by chance, we have now begun, deliberately and systematically, to read the darkness before we ever break through into it. The underground world remains an active frontier, a place still being mapped, still being questioned, still being read by hands that no longer need to touch the stone to know that it is there. Consider what happened in the town of Nevşehir, in the very heart of Cappadocia, in the year 2013. It began, as so many of these discoveries begin, with an accident of demolition. Construction workers, clearing away buildings near a Byzantine-era hilltop castle to make way for an urban renewal project, drove their machines into the tuff, and the tuff opened beneath them into darkness. What they had struck was not a cellar, not a cistern, not a single carved room, but the edge of something vast, something whose true dimensions no one at the surface could yet imagine. And here is where the story departs from all that came before. For this time the response was not merely a torch and a rope and a cautious descent into the unknown. This time the Earth itself was interrogated. A geophysical survey followed, employing resistivity mapping and seismic tomography, techniques that send pulses of energy into the ground and read the echoes that return, building a portrait of what lies below without ever disturbing it. And the portrait that emerged was staggering. The complex beneath Nevşehir, the survey suggested, might span as much as 5 million square feet. It might reach a depth of 113 meters, deeper by nearly 30 meters than Derinkuyu itself. If the readings hold, If the excavation confirms what the instruments have whispered, then the largest underground city yet known lies not in some remote and unexplored corner of the world, but directly beneath a living Turkish town, beneath the foundations of houses and shops and streets where people have walked for generations, unaware of the immensity sleeping under their feet. The mayor of Nevşehir, Hasan Ünver, called the discovery a new pearl for Cappadocia's already extraordinary crown of historical riches, and yet a pearl is a strange metaphor for a thing born of fear, a hollow carved to hide the living, now recast as treasure. But then, perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the underground has always been a kind of pearl, something precious formed slowly in darkness around an irritant that could not be endured. What was the irritant here? What threat over what centuries drove hands to hollow out 5 million square feet of solid rock, deeper than any refuge yet found? The instruments can tell us the shape of the emptiness. They cannot yet tell us the shape of the fear that made it. Half a world away, in the high, thin air of the Peruvian Andes, a different technology is peeling back a different silence. Above the sacred valley, above the terraces and the megaliths of Ollantaytambo, aircraft have passed carrying instruments that scan the ground with pulses of laser light, stripping away vegetation and shadow to reveal the bare bones of the terrain below. And in the geophysical investigations that have accompanied these scans near Ollantaytambo, anomalies have emerged, patterns in the subsurface consistent with buried walls, with foundations, with structures that no surviving record describes and no living memory recalls. The implications ripple outward through everything we thought we knew about this place. For these findings suggest that Ollantaytambo was not raised in a single visionary act, but built and abandoned and reoccupied across multiple phases, layer upon layer, the work of one age raised atop the ruins of another, the whole palimpsest older and stranger, and more discontinuous than the tidy chronologies had ever allowed. The megaliths that seem to speak of a single moment of impossible achievement may instead be the surviving fragments of a far longer conversation between people and stone, a conversation whose earliest words have been buried so deep and for so long that only the laser's cold precision can now detect their echo. Who built the first walls at Ollantaytambo? Who abandoned them, and why? And who returned, generations later, to build again atop the graves of a work they may no longer have understood? The scans have opened the questions. They have not begun to answer them. And in China, in the sandstone chambers of Longyou, the interrogation continues by yet another means. Not the echo of seismic waves, not the sweep of laser light, but the slow, patient reading of dirt. For decades, the age of the Longyou grottos has rested on a single fragile pillar. The clay pots recovered from the silt, Western Han in style, placing the caverns somewhere in the long span between 206 years before our era and the year 23 of it. But a pot proves only that a pot was there. It does not prove when the chamber was cut, only that at some point someone dropped or left or buried a vessel in a space already carved. And so scientists have turned to the fill itself, to the accumulated sediment that has settled, grain by grain, into these chambers across the silent millennia. Sediment analysis, applied to the layers of that fill, may yet yield a more precise date than any pot could offer, reading the deposition of the earth like the rings of a tree, counting the years in the slow arithmetic of settling dust. It is a humble science, this study of sediment. No torches, no dramatic descent, no farmers standing awestruck in a drained cavern, only the microscope, the core sample, the careful separation of one layer of silt from the next. And yet it carries within it the possibility of answering, at last, the question that has haunted Longyou since the day the pond was drained. Not who built it, for that mystery may never yield, but when, and in what world, under what pressure, in flight from what unrecorded terror, These million cubic meters of stone were removed by hands that left no name. What all of this reveals is that the story of the underground is not a closed book, but an open excavation. The questions that have run through every chamber of this journey, who dug them, what they feared, why the technique arose and peaked and seemed to vanish, are not the settled conclusions of a finished science. They are live wires. Beneath Nevsha here, the deepest city yet may still be waiting for its first proper descent. Beneath the sacred valley, buried walls hint at history's no chronicle preserves. Beneath the silt of Longyou, the true age of the impossible caves may finally be surfacing grain by patient grain. The subterranean map of our world is far from complete. It is being redrawn even now, in laboratories and survey tents, and the cramped cockpits of low-flying aircraft, by people who have learned to read the darkness without breaking into it, to hear the hollow places speak before ever setting foot inside them, and every new reading deepens rather than resolves the central enigma. For each anomaly detected, each chamber confirmed, each date refined only sharpens the original question into a finer point. Why did so many peoples, across so many lands and so many centuries, come to the same terrible conclusion, that the only safe place was down, in the dark, behind a door that could be sealed from within? The instruments grow more sensitive with every passing year. The mystery does not grow any smaller, and here, perhaps, is where we should pause and turn the question outward, away from the ancient world and its vanished builders, and toward ourselves. For it is tempting, standing at the mouth of Derinkuyu, or in the drained silence of Longyou, to imagine that we are looking at something finished, something belonging wholly to the past, a strange and terrible chapter of human history that closed when the last refugees climbed back into the light and the doors were sealed forever. It is tempting to speak of the technique as though it truly vanished, as though the knowledge of how to carve a city into the earth and hide beneath it died with the guilds and the empires and the frightened generations who wielded it. But this comfort is an illusion. The technique did not vanish. It never vanished at all. We simply stopped noticing it, because we stopped calling it by the old names, and because the fear that drives it wears in every age a different face. Consider the granite heart of Colorado, where between the years 1961 and 1966, the United States hollowed out the interior of Cheyenne Mountain and built inside it a city that would outlast the end of the world. 2,000 feet of solid rock were driven through to reach the chamber where the North American Aerospace Defense Command would keep its vigil, a complex of 15 freestanding buildings, sealed behind blast doors, sheltered beneath the weight of an entire mountain, and here the ancient logic reasserts itself with an almost unbearable precision. For the builders of Cheyenne Mountain understood, as the diggers of Derinkuyu had understood, that stone protects but stone also transmits, that a blast which cannot crush a mountain can still travel through it as a shockwave, shattering everything rigid within. And so they did something extraordinary. They mounted the entire city, all 15 buildings, upon 1,319 massive steel springs, each weighing 1,000 pounds, so that when the shockwave came, the buried city could sway with it rather than break against it, could ride the tremor of an apocalypse the way a ship rides a wave, flexing, absorbing, enduring. It is the rolling stone door reimagined for the atomic age. It is the same instinct that mounted a 500-kilogram basalt disc in an angled niche so that fear could seal itself in from within. Only now the fear is not of Arab raiders or Mongol horsemen, but of the missile, the flash, the fallout. The door is thicker, the threat is larger, the impulse is exactly the same. Or consider Switzerland, that small mountainous nation whose bunker building has become not a wartime expedient, but a permanent condition of national life. Following a constitutional vote in the year 1959, the Swiss committed themselves to something no ancient civilization ever attempted: universal shelter, a place underground for every single citizen. Over the decades that followed, they built a network of more than 370,000 shelters, private and public, until the total capacity exceeded 100% of the country's population of some 9 million souls. There is, in principle, a hardened refuge waiting for every man, woman and child in Switzerland, and then some. So thoroughly is this instinct woven into the fabric of Swiss life that the shelters, in the long stretches of peace between imagined catastrophes, are quietly repurposed for the ordinary business of living. They become wine cellars. They become storage rooms. Families keep their preserves and their skis and their forgotten furniture in chambers built to survive a nuclear detonation. The historian Sylvia Berger-Ziaudin has described this bunker mentality as part of the Swiss national DNA, rooted in a long history of defensive neutrality, a nation that survived the centuries by preparing always to disappear beneath its own mountains if the world above should turn against it. And is this not precisely the logic of Nushabad, where every kitchen concealed a secret door, where the entrance to the refuge was hidden behind the oven and beneath the floor, woven so completely into the rhythm of daily life that the boundary between the ordinary house and the extraordinary hiding place dissolved entirely? The Swiss have simply made explicit and universal what Nushabad made secret and selective: the conviction that beneath every home there ought to be a hollow, a shelter, a place to seal yourself away when the surface becomes unlivable. And then there is Beijing, and the vast subterranean warren that the Chinese would come to call Dixia Cheng, the underground city. In the year 1969, as the Sino-Soviet split hardened from ideological rupture into the genuine fear of war between two nuclear powers, Chairman Mao Zedong issued a directive of stark and ancient simplicity: dig tunnels deep, store food, and prepare for war. And the people obeyed. Approximately 300,000 citizens and soldiers took up their tools and hand-dug a network that would eventually sprawl across some 85 square kilometers beneath the streets of the capital, a subterranean city intended to shelter Beijing's population from nuclear or chemical attack, complete with schools, with theatres, with factories, with everything a besieged people might need to go on living in the dark. 300,000 pairs of hands carving a refuge out of the earth beneath a great city, driven by the fear of a catastrophe descending from above. Set that image beside the drained caverns of Longyou, where the archaeologist Liu Weijin once estimated that 1,000 workers laboured for 6 years to remove 1 million cubic metres of stone, and the distance between the ancient world and our own collapses to nothing. The tools changed, the scale changed, the enemy changed. But the answer, dig deep, hide the people, prepare to endure, did not change at all. It is the oldest answer we have, and in 1969, with the whole apparatus of the modern state behind it, 300,000 people gave it again. There is something almost vertiginous in laying these two worlds side by side. On one side, the vanished builders of antiquity, the anonymous hands of Longyou, the Byzantine refugees of Cappadocia, the Sassanid diggers of Nushabad, the frightened generations who carved the Muches of Picardy and the Chinkanas beneath Cusco. On the other, the engineers of Cheyenne Mountain with their 1,000-pound springs, the Swiss with their 370,000 shelters, the 300,000 diggers of Beijing's underground city. We have long told ourselves that we are the inheritors of the ancient builders' skills but not their fears, that we have machines where they had chisels, blueprints where they had oral memory, science where they had only terror and instinct. And in one sense this is true, but in the sense that matters most it is not true at all. For the impulse that drove them and the impulse that drives us are the same impulse, unbroken across every intervening century. The conviction, arising again and again in the human breast whenever the surface of the world becomes a place of danger, that safety lies downward, in the dark, behind a door that only we can open. The technique never vanished. We only lost sight of it, because we were looking for it in the wrong places, in the ruins of dead empires, when it was living all along beneath our own feet, in the mountains of Colorado, in the cellars of Switzerland, in the hand-dug tunnels beneath the streets of Beijing. What we changed was not the answer. What we changed was the question. What we changed was the thing we were hiding from. The Byzantines hid from the raiders whose horses could be heard on the plains above. The people of Nushabad hid from the invaders who swept periodically across their land. The diggers of Longyou hid from something we cannot name, something erased so completely from the record that its very namelessness has become the deepest part of the mystery. And we hide from the missile that we ourselves invented, from the fallout of our own ingenuity, from the war that our own power made possible. The threat migrated. The threat grew, from the raider on horseback to the warhead on its ark, from a danger you could hear approaching to a danger that would arrive faster than sound. But the response never migrated at all. It stayed exactly where it had always been, down, in the dark, behind the sealed door. And perhaps that is the true and final answer to the question that has run beneath this entire journey. The question of why the technique of underground refuge seemed to arise and peak and vanish across the ancient world. It did not vanish because we forgot how to build. It seemed to vanish because, for a few short centuries, the surface felt safe enough that we did not need it. And the moment that feeling passed, the moment the world above turned dangerous again in a new and terrible way, the old knowledge returned, unbidden and unbroken, as though it had never left, because it never had. It was only sleeping, the way the chambers of Derinkuyu slept beneath the floors of a living town, waiting for the wall to break and the light to come flooding back. So we return, at the last, to where we began, to the smell of stone and darkness, to the cool air rising from the levels below, to the sensation of standing at a threshold between the world of the sun and the world of the sealed door. Across 10,000 years and 5 continents, the same story repeats itself with only its costumes changed. A people grows afraid, the surface becomes a place of terror, and so they turn to the one refuge that has never failed them, the refuge that is older than writing, older than the city, older perhaps than any structure raised toward the sky. They turn to the earth, and they dig, and they carve out a hollow in the dark, and they seal the door behind them, and they wait. The Phrygians did it. The Byzantines did it. The nameless diggers of Longyou did it. The refugees of Naur did it while the guns of the Somme thundered overhead. And we do it still, behind blast doors and 1,000-pound springs, in cellars and command centres, and the hand-dug tunnels beneath our great cities, telling ourselves all the while that we are nothing like the frightened peoples of the ancient world. Stand then in any of these places, in the drained silence of Phoenix Hill, in the deep dark of Derinkuyu's 18th level, in the hardened heart of Cheyenne Mountain, in the wine cellars of Switzerland that were built to survive the end of everything. Feel the weight of the stone above you, and the cool, patient air, and the darkness that has held its secrets so long and so well. And ask yourself not who dug these places, nor what they feared, nor why the technique seemed to vanish. For we have followed those questions as far as the light will take us, and they open, always, onto deeper questions still. Ask instead the one question that these silent chambers have been asking us all along, from beneath the floors of our kitchens and the foundations of our towns and the granite of our mountains, waiting, as the stone has always waited for someone to hear it. Not who were they hiding from, but who are we still hiding from? And when the door seals behind us at last in the dark we have carved for ourselves, will there be anyone left above to wonder what we feared and why we dug so deep, and where in all that patient stone we finally chose to disappear?